And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. It's fantastic to be here with everyone. Already an excellent crowd and good questions in the ideas room now, of course, as usual. And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. Absolutely great crowd tonight. And as usual, I'm joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And it's quite interesting that we've got something special for you tonight, because we have Walter Bosley joining us, who is just releasing a new book this weekend, and we've got the sneak preview of it. It's very, very interesting and gets into a lot of details that he hasn't before. So we're very much looking forward to that. But this is X Series 70. And think about this. We've done two-parters or so. So we're up to about 74, 75 episodes of the show. But with X Series 70, we're going to do something very special, which is we're going to open up a vista into history on the UFO file and the hot zone, and how there are figures and there is information that has been looked at by extremely good researchers. And yet, because they weren't looking for what we're looking for, some things that were crucially important were missed. Now, a couple of weeks ago, we introduced how the importance of Lindbergh at Roswell, and also Lindbergh's activities as an aerial archaeologist. So this episode is following right in the footsteps of that one, and it's quite explosive. It deals with Wesley Ketchum, who was a professor of astronomy out of Drake University, and really one of the kind of main scholars on the UFO subject in the 1950s. Now, unusually, Mr. Jessup met a very unfortunate end, and this was at the hands of a group that I've referred to here as X-Protect. X-Protect is a group that takes the information around the X technology and safeguards it, sometimes with lethal means, sometimes with other kinds of means, keeping it out of the public eye. But in Jessup's case, they absolutely had to take him out, and I'm going to explain why. And I'm also going to explain how the mystery schools are at the very heart of this. And before I get too far along, how is the crowd tonight?
It's a fantastic crowd tonight.
Yeah, absolutely. It's great. Seeing a lot of familiar faces. And we're going to be joined by Walter sometime around 9 p.m. Eastern. So I'm going to get as much of this in as I can now. So I'm just going to hop right into it. There are a number of kind of wild things going on, as we've seen, and it's quite amusing. There's a lot of cult activity rising around the UFO world, and it's quite something to watch. And also, we've done a lot of reporting on it, and we'll continue to. I think we have to do an episode of Cultapalooza.
Yes, I agree.
It's just completely over the top. But the nice thing is, we called it long before, so that we've been doing these reports. I was looking back at a report from January 1st, 2018 with Gigi Young, where we went through everything about the TTSA, and it has rolled on and rolled on and rolled on. Of course, that's to the Stars Academy, which is the CIA attempt to infiltrate and sort of just grab the UFO file as a PR stunt and make a profit at the same time. Of course, that kind of stuff, has been going on for a long time, but this is a very bald-faced maneuver, and using the press, which they have such a sway over through the Council on Foreign Relations, to promote their UFO threat idea. And we're going to see that this goes back actually a long way, and that the person we're talking about tonight, Morris Jessup, is in the heart of this kind of activity, and that these forces pushing out the X-Protect type line and the threat line, which is you have to be afraid and we'll protect you. They really figured out that they needed to put this op out there. And so the Central Intelligence Agency cooked this up. And now you have all these people running around TTSA. And I have to say, when I look at TTSA, it's such a obvious CIA operation. Their VP of operations is a 3 decades senior intelligence man. He's a senior CIA guy, Jim Semivan. And so we had Grant Cameron recently doing an interview, and he was talking about how, his sources, he's always close to that TTSA stuff. He's a great UFO researcher. But he said, the people around Semivan are just like, look, we're going to, they have almost $1 trillion military budget now, and we're going to plug some of that in by using this kind of UFO threat idea, and we're going to get the money this time. We're going for the money. So that's Grant's version of it, and I absolutely agree. What we've been watching there is a real disgrace. And what's interesting, and I think one of the more fascinating things about TTSA, before we dive into everything else, is that there were hearings in Congress about how sketchy the setup of that company is. How tricky is that? And how kind of funky does your setup have to be as a corporation that people in Congress are using you as an example of how like you can do shady things if you're set up with a corporation like this, and we shouldn't let this happen. So we have to keep a real eye on this, because this is a very high level, well-financed. And we see that a lot of the players on TTSA act like cult fanboys and cult, they're really rolling out this idea, and it's like, oh, don't question them, whatever you do, or you get all these trolls. Well, that's ridiculous. And, it's not going to stand in this kind of environment, in the independent environment. Maybe in mainstream, like you'll get an interview on Fox where they'll just sit there and listen to Elizondo and go, wow. But it's not going to happen here. So that's very important. I think that the moves that are going on there, and we're seeing a lot of like UFO researchers and people hop on board, and that's very disheartening because they're going to be very disappointed when the time comes. Now, I will say this though about this whole entire effort, which is it's political, largely political, both on the Democratic side and the Republican side. There's a great need to develop some kind of a narrative to roll out some of the technology that's been worked on, and directly through the UFO file, and that's the X technology. Remember, not all of that is by any means all extraterrestrial by a long shot. So we have to look at it and understand the levels of where it comes from. Yes.
I just want to say Joseph is in the chat.
Hey, terrific. It's great to have him out there. We've got to get you back on for November. We were just talking about it, but I hope your travels are going well. And I know Joseph's working on a new book. Of course, I can never get what it's about out of him because he's great at being tight-lipped, Walter, it's a little bit easier. Get him late enough at night. He'll start talking. He'll start spilling secrets. But he's going to be joining us here in about 9 o'clock. But I do feel like, it's very interesting how we're seeing this big push. And a lot of these pushes tend to happen in October and early November. And I'm going to start to figure out the mechanism of how they're doing this. But I know that they originally launched TTSA right there in that window as well. And we've been seeing all kinds of it. All right. So I'd like to always start with a TKO. And, a lot of people just looking at the title, you'd think this is a straight up UFO episode because Morris Jessup is in there. But I want to introduce a few names here and to combine these names. The name Ketchum is a name that is out there, and we see in relation to things like in the Cayce story, for example, it's Dr. Wesley Ketchum who brings him out to the public. And this is quite remarkable. And then there's the name Jessup, which shows up with Morris Jessup, but it also shows up with Clara Jessup. And Clara Jessup is the one who financed people like Keeley and Tesla in the late 19th century, and then became kind of the grand poobah of the Theosophical Society with all her connections. But her son, because her name is Clara Jessup Bloomfield Moore, you might see where this is going if you've been watching the X series. Bloomfield Moore is the person who, Clarence Bloomfield Moore, her son, who created this incredible sort of archaeological discovery line all the way through the hot zone and through Florida. And his amazing works, well, give me that gigantic book for a second. You have to see just the size of this guy's stuff. I mean,
and that's just one edition.
Yeah, this is the East Florida expedition.
But there are some very remarkable things in here which I've shown, which I believe are representations of what Edgar Cayce calls the Two-Eye Stone or Firestone, which is an Atlantean. The Atlanteans had a power source, a power grid that operated off of these stones. Now, what's interesting is that Clarence Bloomfield Moore and his expeditions have been largely suppressed, so much so that even though I've spent a lot of time looking through archaeology for years relating to the hot zone, oddly enough, I've never run across the incredible, fantastic things that he found, which we're going to show again tonight. But it's all in relation to the fact that, we have there someone in the Jessup name line, just like Ketchum is in that Cayce name line. And then we found out that Morris K. Jessup is Morris Ketchum Jessup. And we're going to tell you why that's important as we go along here. But let's take just a quick look at who Morris Jessup was. This is somebody who was born in Indiana, and I have to say his career reads very much, and a lot of people have tried to track him down over time. His career reads like it is 5 different people, actually. This is somebody who is at once in the Navy, is at once a professor of astronomy, is a leading archaeologist of his day, is someone who is working for rubber barons throughout South America, is someone who is taking trips to South Africa, and even has some medical credentials. Quite interesting.
He's a urologist, right?
He's a man for all seasons.
This is
exactly.
crazy.
So he's born in Indiana, and he has this great interest in astronomy, University of Michigan in Ann Arbor in the 20s. Now, what I'm going to call particular attention to is his archaeological work, which is something that unfortunately, and oddly enough, doesn't get talked about very much on the UFO side, because they're so obsessed with the fact that he was associated with the Philadelphia experiment, which is absolutely crucial, but makes a lot more sense when we keep in mind his archaeological credentials. The astronomy thing is interesting, but it's really his archaeological side, which is going to blow everyone's mind tonight. What I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you the end, and then I'm going to basically walk it backwards. Here's the deal. Edgar Cayce gave readings dealing with the fact that firestones related to this 2-eye stone, they were miniature versions. Think of like an iPhone compared to like, a large computer. And then these portable stones would be found in Yucatan in 1933. Note the year. Now, 1933 is a very fascinating year for a number of reasons, but in archaeology and in the Cayce readings, it's particularly unusual because he's saying the first of these stones would be found in the Yucatan. Now, it turns out that Mr. Jessup, Morris K. Ketchum Jessup, he was, in fact, in Yucatan leading an expedition in 1933 with 15 students. And the reason that we know this is because there's a Des Moines, Iowa Register article which states in no uncertain terms that this is his 4th expedition into that area. Jessup, as I said, is a man of mystery, and his 4 books on the UFO file, including the case for the UFO and UFOs in the Bible, which, by the way, for all you Ancient Aliens fans out there, he was the one who really got that rolling. This is 10 years before Eric von Däniken. And he went into all of these deep ideas about how these were actually representations in the Bible of interstellar activity. It's kind of fascinating to me, too, to think about because a lot of people think of Ancient Aliens and they really work with that whole von Däniken thing. This is somebody who's talking about it in 1958.
I know, he kind of hasn't gotten the credit that he's due, don't you think?
Oh, not by a long shot. I think they kind of made sure of that. But there is the mystery of his death. Now, he had a very untimely death, seemingly when he was just at the height of his powers. He had just gotten his 4th book out. And there have been, when they look into these things, there's always the police report that says, well, maybe he was suffering from depression and we should leave it at that. J. Manson Valentine, who was his best friend, stated that he was not depressed and that they were meeting for lunch the next day. And in fact, the whole thing had been set up, and he told him, I have this dramatic opening for you about the Philadelphia experiment and all this work that we've been doing. Now, for those of you who've been following the show, J. Manson Valentine, the name is going to be quite interesting because J. Manson Valentine is the Yale zoologist who found what, Miss Olivia?
The Bimini Road.
Indeed. So, however, Cayce predicted that J. Manson Valentine, or someone, would find the ruins of Poseidia, which is a piece of Atlantis, off the coast of Bimini in 68 or 69. That was in 1943, and he says, not so far away, about 25 years out. In fact, in September of 1968, J. Manson Valentine is flying over, and he sees the Bimini Road, and he dives and finds the Bimini Road. However, J. Manson Valentine is also the best friend for decades of Morris Jessup, and this is 10 years after Jessup's death. So now we have the direct connection right off the bat. J. Manson Valentine finds the Bimini Road, and he is the close friend of Philadelphia experiment UFO file man Morris Jessup. So Morris Ketchum Jessup. Now, J. Manson Valentine is aware then of the prophecy that Edgar Cayce has made. And that's why he's over those ruins around Bimini looking for this. In fact, he does find it. However, the road to how they found that is quite interesting because, in fact, they knew, because Cayce had predicted it, it was going to rise. Now, what Cayce is telling us, and we have to get a handle on this, is that there's an advanced civilization that sank off the east coast of America. And that area that we're calling the hot zone in these episodes, because there are a number of groups that when they go down there and they're scanning the ocean floor, they have to sign NDAs that say, if you see anything in this area, which they call a hot zone, you can't report them, you can't photograph them, and if you mention them, basically, you can be in a lot of trouble. So, and that's not even to think about what they do for military people down there. That's just the civilian operators. Now, I think that when we're looking at Jessup and his knowledge about this, we have to look at his extensive writings on what? Not on the UFO file, on Atlantis. So, yes, Jessup is writing about Atlantis and Lemuria. He's writing about the lost civilizations right in there with his gods in the Bible, UFOs in the Bible. And so we're getting a real handle on him as a theosophical thinker. Now, in theosophy, of course, those are the mystery schools that brought us this information in the first place. And we've done extensive programs on the background of those mystery schools and why they were mentioning Atlantis and why this became part of our consciousness and why we, we're in a battle there between scientific materialism on one hand and then moving into this other area. So it's quite fascinating. When they came out with this in the 1870s and 1880s through the Theosophical Society, things like Atlantis, things like advanced technology, things that were really hearkening back to this advanced civilization suddenly were getting pulled right up there into people's consciousness, so that by the time you get to Edgar Cayce, who does the most complete job on the idea of a lost civilization in that period, I think that we're starting to see the pattern a lot better, so that by the time you get to the 1960s, Atlantis is something they write songs about. There's a Donovan song about way down under the ocean Atlantis, and they did movies about it, and so it becomes part of the popular culture. I mean, Disney just did a cartoon series about it now, so it's still out there, but they make it this vague undersea world. Of course, in pop culture, it's another point about the Godzilla movie, which they made that his headquarters Atlantis and all that. What do you have, Stargate Atlantis? I mean, it's deep out there. But we need to reel it back and figure how did we get to talking about Atlantis in 20th and 21st century? Where did that come from? And that's the mystery schools deciding we're going to let this out because this wave of scientific materialism that's moving in is going to destroy humanity as any kind of recognizable being. And it's going to make it just an automated robotic existence. And so there's a whole sweep of scientific materialism coming in. And so there are people like Rudolf Steiner, who headed up anthroposophy, who have come forward and said this is the decision they had to make in 1840 when this wave of scientific materialism was coming in. So you get all these things that come out like the Fox sisters and like spiritualism. And so we're getting into this phase where all these things need to come out quickly. And some of it is pretty clumsy, actually, if you think about it, and the whole craze of spiritualism. But by the time you get to Blavatsky and her Isis Unveiled and Secret Doctrine, it's they're starting to smooth it out. She's really bringing forward the information. But she proves difficult for the mystery schools to control, and they're divided also about what to give out to the public. So you get all kinds of variations on it. By the time you get to the Rudolf Steiner material in Anthroposophy, we've got a real solid version of what Atlantis was all about. And then the Cayce readings show up. Well, Cayce is saying, well, look, not only were they there, but their stuff is rising. And that they kept records in 3 places in the earth, one in Egypt, one in Bimini, and one in Yucatan. Now, the one in Bimini is sunken off the coast of Bimini in a temple that's rising, and it'll surface in 68 or 69, and that's where J. Manson Valentine and Morris Jessup come in. Now, Jessup, when he is putting out these UFO books, he's going on radio shows, he's writing books, he is giving the UFO file a very scholarly face, and he's revealing a lot. I've talked about some of his books. There's one, UFOs in the Bible, which is really kind of fantastic work and contains a lot of information about what he thinks in terms of ancient technology, which is absolutely crucial. So by the time we get around to 1959, he has really been on the circuit heavily since 1955. And this UFO, part of the UFO craze of the 50s is largely because there were solid people like him around who could give it a very scholarly approach. It wasn't just, people running around with Venus hats and things like that, like you see in some of the conventions, or just this wild scientific push, science fiction push. So I do think it's important for us to kind of think of Jessup as really a stabilizing force. Now, we talk about groups like X-Protect and things that come up like the Men in Black. These are twain, this is the same kind of phenomena. And what we see with groups like the Men in Black is that they operate, not just the way the CIA does. They don't just sanction people, or they don't just do assassinations. And they are seemingly capable of very mystical apparitions, that they can appear and disappear, and they have a very unusual appearance. And they also tend to possess a range of supernatural qualities. So really, X-Protect has an aspect of it, which is what I would refer to, and the Men in Black go with this, an astral agency. And this we see over and over again from very reliable witnesses, that something else is involved here beyond the usual intimidation, threats, assassinations, and things of that nature. Now, the case for the UFO in Jessup's work changed the paradigm around UFOs in the 50s, and they really had to shut that down. Now, one of the interesting things that came up when he was doing it was someone started to write to him about this experiment that took place by the Navy. And this all came to be the Philadelphia experiment. And the original idea was that maybe the people who were writing to him were a collective. That is, it seemed too much for just one person to possess that knowledge and that kind of way of speaking about it. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're in X series episode 70, and it is X-Protect, the most dangerous game, UFOs. The reason I'm going to introduce you to what the most dangerous game is on this as we get along tonight. One of the things I want to point out is that the reason that the UFO file is so guarded is not just in relation to this idea that there are off-world visitors. That's something which I think is certainly part of the consideration. But what I've determined using the X-steganography around the show is that there's an effect that comes out of these things that has to do, whether it's ancient technology or off-world visitors or this higher technology that we get into through people like Tesla, that there's something in it which creates an effect that I've termed apotheum, which is basically a kind of breakaway physics, a reality distortion. And that is the effect that they're guarding, because that is something that they don't know how to control. It's funny that Dr. Farrell's here, because when he's spoken about torsion physics, that's where the apotheum really lands. That's where it seems like. And one of his favorite phrases is, it would make a nuclear bomb look like a firecracker. So when we consider it that way, it is quite remarkable. And between his work on the bell and some of the things that Walter Bosley has done, who's joining us tonight, in talking about Delschau and the early development, perhaps even 19th century development of this Nazi bell technology before the Nazis come into power, of course, as he proved that there were these airships, and much more advanced airships than we had by the Wright brothers in 1860. So it is obviously maybe rooted in this German group that comes over here, and he's going to describe that for us, and comes to California, and is responsible for many of these mysterious airship sightings that we hear about in the late 19th century. Why that's so interesting in relation to this is there seems to be a real move going on between these groups. That is, the mystery schools like Theosophy and Anthroposophy getting information out. Now, I've pointed out how Annie Besant and Theosophy were largely responsible for rescuing and spiriting away John Keely's technology after he died suddenly, and then they tried, through various maneuvers, these corporations of the period tried to paint his partner as a crook, and that the whole thing was a fake, and they wanted to grab the technology. So that stuff was shipped off, and we did an episode last summer about that, but I think the main thrust of it is that those mystery schools had a stake in preserving that technology and making sure it didn't fall into the wrong hands, and I think we see that over and over again when we're dealing with these subjects. The Jessup case is a clear case of Exprotect in operation, which is why I think it's so crucial. So when this fellow starts writing to him after he writes the case for the UFO, he starts saying unusual things to him about different types of technologies that were experimented with by the U.S. Navy in these ultra-secret programs. Now, there's a lot of history, really good history done, even a movie on the Philadelphia experiment. But, so I'm not going to go so deep on the Philadelphia experiment. I want to bring out a couple of things, though, that were in those letters to Jessup from this individual who would eventually be understood to be someone named Carl Allen or Carlos Allende. And he was somebody who was in the Navy, and who for years it was thought, this is a hoax or whatever it happened to be. But when you look at the letters and when you look at the annotations that he did, or someone did, on Jessup's book, obviously somebody possessing a great deal of scientific knowledge, no question. One of the things he's trying to describe to Jessup, that is Carlos Allende, we'll just call him Carl Allen for short. Allen is trying to show Jessup just exactly what happened during this experiment and suggesting he get to the bottom of it. And one of the things he says is, I speak of time for deep frozen men are not aware of time as we know it. This is the kind of strange cadence that he uses when he speaks also and writes. They are like semi-comatose persons who live, breathe, look, and feel, but are still unaware of so utterly many things as to constitute another world to them. A man in an ordinary common frieze is aware of time, sometimes acutely so, yet they are never aware of time precisely as you and I are aware of it. The first deep freeze, as I said, took 6 months to rectify. It also took $5 million worth of electronic equipment and a special ship berth in or around the Philadelphia Navy Yard. You see a group of sailors in the act of putting their hands upon a feller or upon thin air. Observe the digits and appendages of the stricken man. If they seem to waver as though within a heat mirage, go quickly and put your hands upon him. For the man is the very most desperate of men in the world. Not one of these men would ever want at all to become again invisible. I do not think that much more needs to be said as to why man is not ready for force field work. Question mark. So he's giving us an indication there that Project Invisible, Project Rainbow, the Philadelphia experiment, is something that was rumored to have Einstein working on it. And the idea was if you could make something invisible, then other ships couldn't fire upon it, or if you could actually make it disappear altogether and show up somewhere else. So they had the deep physics knowledge to try this, but some of the side effects of it were very, very disturbing. And he actually recites this whole thing about a number of these sailors after they had been experimented on going into a barroom and weird things happening, like, you know, lighting up like a phosphorus lamp and disappearing through walls and things like that. So quite a remarkable story that he's laying on Jessup. But again, Jessup's writing about the UFO file. Why is this guy coming out of the blue and writing these extensive letters about the Philadelphia experiment? So it gets very deep. By the end of his life, just before this supposed suicide, which I'm going to read the report on, Jessup says some interesting things to J. Manson Valentine. And remember, Valentine is the one who found the Bimini Road. Okay, quotes. And this actually comes from Berlitz's book on the Philadelphia experiment. Quote, page 130. The experiment that Morris Ketchum Jessup said to Dr. J. Manson Valentine had been accomplished by using naval-type magnetic generators known as degaussers, which were pulsed at resonant frequencies as to create a tremendous magnetic field on and around a docked vessel. So he's describing it as basically they've tripped into this technology, and this is what's happening. A magnetic field is creating this effect. Quote, the experiment is very interesting but awfully dangerous. It is too hard on the people involved. Well, there's no doubt about that. This use of magnetic resonance is tantamount to temporary obliteration in our dimension, but it tends to get out of control. Actually, it is equivalent to transference of matter into another level or dimension and could represent a dimensional breakthrough if it were possible to control it. Unquote. This is what Jessup told Valentine shortly before his death. And one last one. In practice, it concerns electric and magnetic fields as follows. An electrical field is created in a coil, which induces a magnetic field at right angles to the first. Each of these fields represents one plane of space, but since there are 3 planes of space, there must be a third field, perhaps a gravitational one. By hooking up electromagnetic generators so as to produce a magnetic pulse, it must be possible to produce this third field through the principle of resonance. That is J. Manson Valentine speaking 9 years before he finds the Bimini Wall. Mm-hmm. Quite remarkable. But we can see that something really off the charts was happening here in Morris Jessup's knowledge. Now, what happens in the sequence of his death is quite remarkable. As I said, over the course of 5 years, he's become the UFO go-to expert. He's done these long, long radio shows. But as I said, also, his unusual career before that in archaeology, as a professor of astronomy, in the Navy, going to Peru to lead excavations, going to Yucatan, concentrating on meteor sites in the Yucatan.
Craters.
Quite remarkable. Craters, yes.
Yeah.
And
well,
the vast magnetic fields, yes.
When you were describing all the different things that he did, you know, it just begs the question, was he a spy?
Yes. And are we always dealing with the same person? He's got a little bit of almost an Oswald quality there, except he was so public, and this is what's remarkable about him. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're in to the X Series episode 70. It is X Protect, UFOs, the most dangerous game. And I'm going to tell you what the most dangerous game is. In a little bit here, we're going to have author Walter Bosley to tell us about his new book. There is a UFO angle to this book, so we're going to put these two things together. And I've taken a look at it. He sent me some of the chapters in advance, and it's quite interesting. I'm going to have him tell you about what that's all about. Here is a quick snapshot. This is written by Nick Redfern, actually, and it's just a little commentary on Jessup's death. Now, Jessup was found in Florida remember, he's in Indiana. That's where his home is. But he had gone to New York to see this publisher about a new book contract. And then he had bought a new home in Florida. And he drove down there. Now, originally, when he had driven down there, he was in a car accident. And this whole sequence kind of repeated itself. But he was all right. He was not heavily, I mean, he was injured, but it wasn't life-threatening or anything of that nature. However, after he'd gone from Indiana to New York this next time around and met with the publisher, he drove again to Florida, and he calls up his friend, J. Manson Valentine, who finds the Bimini Road a few years later, and he says, I found a real breakthrough on the Philadelphia experiment. This is what we have to talk about. I need you to meet me as soon as possible. Before that can happen, in the early evening of April 20th, 1959, the lifeless body of Morris Jessup was found in his car, which was parked in the Matheson Hammock Park in Miami, Florida. Now, the car's engine was still running, and a hose pipe affixed to the exhaust had been fed through the driver's side window. Jessup was dead from the effects of carbon monoxide poisoning. Jessup's body was found by a man named John Good, who worked at the park. He quickly called the police, who arrived in no time at all. While it looked like Jessup had killed himself, not everyone was quite so sure that things were so black and white. The window through which the hose was stuffed with a couple of towels to prevent air from getting in and carbon monoxide from getting out. Curiously, Mrs. Jessup confirmed the towels were not theirs. Why, if Jessup took his own life, did he not take towels from the family home? What would have been the point of buying new towels? If he did buy such towels, where was the receipt? It wasn't in the car or in any of Jessup's pockets. This is the first real indication that the suicide was something that was intentionally done to Jessup in order to silence him for what he had just discovered about these unusual experiments. Now, you have to remember with Jessup, he's deep in the hot zone. He's done the archaeology in Yucatan, and I'm going to reveal something that about him in relation to that in just a moment that is going to really reframe his picture in history. But also, he is the key man on the UFO file by 1959. His 4 books are basically the benchmark for what you need to do. That's what others are measured against. And he's one of the few scholars who's really in on this. You know, we have a lot of kind of gadflies who are around the subject in the 50s. And a lot of those were plants too, to make sure that people didn't ask the right questions. So with his knowledge now, with him being targeted by this whistleblower with information about the Philadelphia experiment, Jessup is absolutely someone that X-Protect, this group, who will operate with lethal force to silence people. And we've seen that over and over again with the Men in Black. And their methods change so that they don't always use those methods, but they might use public discrediting. They might use different ways and means. So X-Protect is the group. And they're basically working against another group that I've identified as X-Share. And I've identified people like Thomas Townsend Brown being in the X-Share part of it. That is, we make a breakthrough in science and they want to share it with the rest of the world. Unfortunately, we get into these other groups who don't want to do that kind of sharing. And that's the group X-Protect. Are there varying levels in between? You bet. No question at all. However, we do have these kind of variations on the power levels, because even the Kennedy administration, when it was there, had an X-Share quality to it. And he was somebody who knew X-Share people and had really worked closely with them over the years. So we have to be able to understand those two groups instead of a lot of the mumbo jumbo junk from the CIA that we get about TTSA and, metamaterials and junk like that. They've had that stuff for years, by the way. And the videos that they're showing, that they're touting through the media and all that, were released in 2007 on YouTube. Okay. So they're not giving you much there at all. But we have to understand why those forces exist and where they came from. So we have to understand the X-Protect group and things like the Men in Black and the kind of supernatural aspects because of the abilities that they have. And then the X-Share group, who are people who've worked on that black level. They've worked in black projects, but their goals are different. And maybe even when they were first working on those things, they were, being told, yeah, we're going to release this stuff. But after a while, they get the picture. So we need to keep that in mind as we go here. One thing I want to point out about Jessup in relation to his work with the Philadelphia experiment and beyond is that I believe the reason he was the key man in all this is literally because he had been working in Yucatan with the Cayce readings, doing excavations in the hot zone. The same way we've seen people like Lindbergh working archaeologically in the hot zone, the same way we've seen people like Hemingway and Bimini and his brother Lester Hemingway working archaeologically in the hot zone over and over again. And then, of course, Claire Jessup Bloomfield Moore. So we've made a really strong case there. But I think with Jessup being there in 1933 in Yucatan and the Cayce reading suggesting this is what's going on there, and they are finding these stones and they don't know what they mean yet, this is a very important departure point. Yes, Miss Olivia.
I had a great question here. Remedy Report said, what about the Firestone Tire Company? Is that the company that he was representing when he went down for rubber, to find rubber?
Well, it's very interesting, actually. Harvey Firestone comes a little bit in that time frame, the 1920s. I didn't find a relationship between Jessup and Firestone, but that's a very good thing to look into. If you look back to an episode that we did, and it has to be now maybe in April or May, we did a whole thing on Harvey Firestone. So it's definitely there in the descriptions. And Firestone is interesting in terms of who he's connected to. But there's no question that the name itself gives that connotation. Everyone, you're watching the X series number 70. We are in X Protect. UFOs, the most dangerous game. We have Walter Bosley will be joining us shortly. He has a new book, and he's going to be here telling us all about it. I'm going to now turn to the Edgar Cayce reading about the Firestones so that we understand exactly what we're talking about here. And I just want to mention this in relation to Cayce. Cayce was somebody who, in terms of psychic material, had an incredible ability and flexibility in looking at medical readings and in looking at world affairs, public events. He really had this ability in a way that was so well documented that we don't have to guess, was he somebody who was, hoaxing or something like that. He had been doing these readings for 40 years, and the body of work is astounding. One of the key areas that he looked into was Atlantis, which I think we have to get a handle on the idea this is a really important aspects that the mystery schools are working through him to get out to the public. And for what he described really is this period of time where, we raised to this level where we become aware that there was an advanced culture that was back there. Now, very often when people think advanced cultures, they're thinking, well, ancient Egyptian culture is pretty advanced. Edgar Cayce said that the Atlanteans possessed television, that they possessed flight, that they possessed firestones, power stations throughout, and that they had the ability not only to fly over things, but fly through things, which suggests a kind of dematerialization. So this is incredibly high technology. And he said it was all run by something called the Two-Eye Stone, which is spelled Tuaoi. And the Two-Eye Stone is something that we've covered extensively on the program, but it forms a key aspect of Cayce's story of what was going on there in Atlantis. He said that right here, basically, this is our map of the hot zone here. And he said that here, where we've got Bimini highlighted, there it is, right off the coast of Florida, that is where Poseidia was in the Poseidian temple rising off of Bimini. And then later on, we find these ruins that Polina Zalitsky found a whole Cuban city off of the western tip of Cuba. And here is the Yucatan, where Morris Jessup, Yucatan Peninsula, that's where Morris Jessup was concentrating most of his archaeological activities. Now, Jessup obviously had some inside information about all this because somebody just doesn't go into these areas for the heck of it. I mean, there were excavations for sure, but when you look at the track of his history and his familiarity with Theosophy and Atlantis, coming into Cayce and getting a reading from Cayce, for example, is something that we can imagine very easily. Cayce was very accessible in those days and didn't die until 1945, which is 12 years after this excavation took place. So here is what Cayce had to say about the firestones in Yucatan. So first he talks about what they can do. 1, as to the manner and ways the various crafts carried individuals from place to place in what may be known in the present as photographing from a distance, or the fields of activity that showed the ability for reading inscriptions through walls, even at distances, or for the preparations of the elevation and the various activities, there was the overcoming of the forces of nature or gravity itself. So they had anti-gravity vehicles. The forces of nature, gravity itself, and the preparations through the crystal, the mighty, terrible crystal that made for the active principle in these were a portion of the activity of the entity in that experience. Much of it brought destruction. So the story that Cayce has is that they got to a certain level, these Atlanteans, and that half the groups, the Amelius group, were using the technology for spiritual purposes. This other group, the Belial group, were using it the same way X-Protect was using it to kind of dominate other groups. So they had materialized this kind of spiritual function of the stones. Now, when he was talking to people about who were curious about these stones, he would give indications for when they were going to be found, etc. And in this reading, he gives us an idea of where they were. And he says the records were carried from the Atlanteans. The records were carried to what is now Yucatan in America, where these stones that they know so little about are now, during the last few months, being uncovered. Okay, now, this is in 1933 when this reading is being given. The expedition by Morris K. Ketchum Jessup is taking place in 1933 with 15 of his students. It's the 4th time he's been there. And so Cayce goes on. There is an emblem of the firestones. In Yucatan, there is an emblem of same. Let's clarify this, for it may more easily be found. Quote, in Yucatan, there was an emblem of same. Let's clarify this, for it may be the more easily found. For they will be brought to this America, these United States. A portion is to be carried, as we find, to the Pennsylvania State Museum. A portion is to be carried to the Washington preservations of such findings, or to Chicago. The stones that are set in the front of the temple between the service temple and the outer court temple. And then he said, he goes deeply into the records that the Atlanteans put there. But when he describes this excavation and where they're going to take these materials, and we find Jessup right in the middle of that excavation, and we find Jessup very active in Pennsylvania and very active in Washington, D.C., which is where he moved shortly after this. We can make a case here that Morris Jessup was the one who was discovering the firestones. That's why J. Manson Valentine finds the Bimini Wall. That's why they're best friends. They're part of X-Share. X-Protect eliminates Jessup because by 1959, he's got the UFO file under control. He's got UFOs in the Bible describing the ancient Atlanteans. He's got the Theosophical talking points. And he's got J. Manson Valentine, who apparently is quite an expert on Cayce because he eventually uses the Cayce readings to find the Bimini Wall. That is the description of deep, deep, deep mystery school activity. So this idea of Jessup, being bumped off because he knew things about UFOs or whatever, well, there's no question that he was eliminated for the knowledge that he had. However, the reason that he had that knowledge, he had more knowledge than just there are UFOs out there. I mean, he was an astronomer. He understood. He put out some very unusual theories, including the fact that between Mars and Venus, there was a space where these groups could kind of operate without us being able to see them. And then it got very, very deep that they were operating on a different dimensional level, and that's where they were coming from. So his work goes incredibly deep. And as I said, he suggests the whole kind of ancient alien scenario. What I think we have to keep in mind, however, is this isn't just some UFO guy. When we look at the traditional history around Morris Jessup, they basically are looking for two things. They're looking for information. The researchers are looking for information on the UFO file. They're looking for information on the Philadelphia experiment. They are not looking for mystery schools in the hot zone and Atlantis Rising. Those are things that they're not really thinking about. But when you see the person who discovered the Bimini Wall, which is a portion of the Temple of Poseidia that Cayce talked about, being Jessup's best friend, and you have Jessup in the Yucatan doing these incredible excavations in 1933 when Cayce says they're being discovered and he's mentioning them, then we start to get the understanding that Jessup is a very dangerous character to those who don't want those secrets out. Now, all of that material, remember, the advanced technology, whether it's ancient or whether it's alien, it all resides inside of the UFO file as X technology. That's why they developed that system of X steganography. Yes.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, especially if he was a spy, if he
Yes.
he was allowed to share a certain amount, but when it came to the Philadelphia experiment, they had to shut him down fast and
True.
hard and permanently.
True.
That's intriguing.
Well, his double, triple, and quadruple life is, any researcher that looks at it, when they try to go after that early portion of his life, it's a real mess to track because he's in South America, he's in South Africa, which is kind of rare in those days.
I mean, somebody's funding all that. That's very expensive.
It is.
Mm-hmm.
Well, when we think about it, when he emerges later and he's a professor of astronomy, that's a kind of relatively sedate experience from what he was doing with all these expeditions.
Well, when you're a professor, you are a professor. You teach, right?
Yes.
You're there at the university.
Yes.
So you don't go off on an archaeological dig and multiple ones when you're not even an archaeologist.
Yes.
That's not your field of study.
And
right?
he's one of the best.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what's interesting is, and I want to point this out, is that the person who brings the Cayce readings out, his name is Dr. Wesley Ketchum, and he's a doctor who travels down to Kentucky, and he develops all of these case histories around Edgar Cayce and brings him before what? A board of doctors, the New York Times, and all the rest in 1910. And that is how the word of Cayce's work gets spread initially. That's where all those people send in requests for readings because of these articles. But it's all triggered by Wesley Ketchum. Now, you're going to see this dance between the Jessup name and the Ketchum name goes on through history and has very, very unusual connotations. And I've just introduced some of them tonight. We're going to go deeper in another episode just dealing with that. But I think we've put together now Clara Jessup, Bloomfield Moore, who remember did the Florida excavations, and Wesley Ketchum bringing out Edgar Cayce. This is a mystery school push working through these families and groups. And what I think we need to really understand is that, when we have Valentine and Jessup, Morris Jessup and J. Manson Valentine working together for decades and being close friends, so close to the Cayce file, and we have the Hemingway's family so close to the Cayce file, and we have Hemingway living in Bimini, we have to redraw the map of how we look at these things. We've got a completely different situation, which, involves artifact smuggling, intel about artifacts, and a whole operations that are involved in the hot zone, which affect vast geopolitical ramifications and take us through historical characters provably on the ground, like Hemingway, like Lindbergh, like Jessup, like Valentine. And remember, in the Lindbergh episode where we showed the information about Valentine's letters that were discovered in a museum about Florida pyramids and the incredible things that Bloomfield Moore found there, which we believe are representations of this two-eye stone, then the whole picture starts to form together. And we get kind of a better picture of what they were doing and why archaeology was such a huge thing that was being funded by these people. Well, what knocked those efforts, those kind of ex-share efforts, off the table? It's all very interesting to think about. One thing I want to point out here is that we have something called Cape Morris Jessup up here. And that is at the tip of Greenland. So it's an interesting name. It also is missing an S from the Jessup that we know. So what is it? Well, it turns out that he has an uncle who did drop the S from his name. And this is somebody who was one of the attendants of Jekyll Island, where they determined...
Did he set it up himself? He was in charge of it?
He certainly was. And this is somebody we're going to get into in another episode as a follow-up to this. But I want to point out that Morris Jessup, his family line, is incredibly wealthy, and they were particularly interested in archaeology. And where were they interested in that archaeology? In the Arctic. And that's why at the tip of Greenland, we have Cape Morris Jessup. So we need to connect those dots a lot better in terms of who these people were. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist program. We've gone deep, deep now into Morris Jessup, and you can already feel that we're just scratching the surface between the Atlantis Rising aspect of this, the hot zone aspect. Again, we have Yucatan again, and the UFO file, where Jessup, being kind of the central character of the UFO file in the 1950s, one of the most respected. We're going to have Walter Bosley joining us shortly, and I'm going to do a quick check here to see if Walter has sent me, because we'll see if we... Well, he's not there yet.
We can certainly fill the time. So let me just ask you right now.
Yes.
Louis von Beethoven wanted to know, did Jessup ever report a visit by the MIBs? So
Yes. Oh, yeah, absolutely. In
So
fact,
what
he
is
was
his
he was
experience with it?
sanctioned by the Men in Black. I think that I want to mention this if Walter is watching, as we see that screen over there. It seems like he is trying to join in. All you need to do, it looks like you may have to change your browser. You might have to use Chrome or Firefox. I don't know what browser that you're on, but all you have to do, you have joined, but when I go to add you to the stream, you're not showing up. So all you have to do, somehow it's working with that. You should be able to do it. You can send us a message here. Oh, did he just pop up?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so if he's there, all he has to do, but when we come up, Walter, when I press on your, we'll try it again. You see how you're coming up? That means your video feed is not coming in. So we're not getting your video feed. So what I would suggest is try the link again. It may not be working on your phone. You may have to use your laptop instead, but I'm sure we'll get you in there. We've overcome bigger technical issues than that.
In the meantime,
Yes.
Esoteric 369 Wall wanted to say, Olivia, tell Daniel we thank his parents for their free thinking to share you with us to learn from. A lot of people wanted to know more about your parents and how is it that you grew up with the Cayce readings.
Well, that's interesting. I mean,
Your mom's an artist.
yeah, I think that the easiest way to think about it is my interests stretched into unusual areas. And what's odd is that the way I understand how the first Cayce book got into my house is my dad was looking for something medical, and that came up. But he was very familiar with the UFO file material, and he certainly, I don't think that he spent most of his time on that material, but he was aware of it, and that stuff was around there. And what I feel is that there's no question that it was that kind of environment where it was pretty open in terms of what you wanted to find and what you could get interested in. But it took me maybe I think it was the very first Edgar Cayce book I read was probably when I was 7 years old. So it is, yeah, it gets very interesting when I go back there. When I do the autobiography, watch out. Right?
What's amazing is, it's very difficult to understand the Cayce readings. It's almost like the language is biblical, right? It has its own kind of form of language.
Yes.
I have a really difficult time understanding.
Thy and thou.
Yeah, well, it's just not normal speak, but you somehow understand it innately. Your comprehension of them is just so fast.
I think it's interesting when I see other channeled material at times, you'll see language and it will be like, it makes things too clear, it's like, and then, the Pleiadians came down to save us and boom, boom. And it makes things too easy. The Cayce readings are not easy by a long shot. You have to spend time with them, but they're so erudite and they're so structured. They're so fascinating. And the way that I would think of them is you can imagine that in terms of the psychic ability that Cayce had was very unusual to start with. One of the things you want to think about is where he got those abilities. And according to his own readings, he was a priest in Egypt named Rata who had brought over the Atlanteans and saved their material and was part of the original laying out of the Sphinx Giza Plateau. That's very important because it gives us the understanding of why Cayce, who had a 6th grade education, was somebody who, had this incredible ability to tap this, but only when he was in an unconscious trance. When he was conscious, he had none of this ability. He was psychic, but he didn't have the intellectual heft or the intuitive insight that you got when you were dealing with those readings, which really could go anywhere. So I did see those notes from Walter. Walter,
so Chrome is not cooperating, is what he says.
You can use Firefox, but I would suggest not using the phone. Hop on your laptop. Just use the laptop as it is. It seems to work the best. And we'll be here. We're not going anywhere. We'll definitely get you on. But you were there, you showed up, so it is getting through. You just need to kind of maybe try it through a Firefox browser. It should be easier. Keep with it, stay with it. We're going to bring you on board. But the link that you have should be working. Okay, fantastic. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We are trying to pull in Walter Bosley, who he has a new book called Confessions of a Spooky Mind, which is this is about him and the work that he's doing. So we're definitely looking at something with him where, he's been reporting on these things like Nimza and his Empire of the Wheels series, which we've had him on on a number of occasions. And that type of work about the very early airship mystery and the Delshau paintings and how advanced all of that was is quite fascinating. Now, it looks to me like we have a situation where he's doing this autobiographical look. And when I was looking at those chapters, it is fascinating. And the book is going to be released this weekend. Now, if you know Walter Bosley's work, he does all of this through Lulu. And he figured out that, just going through Amazon and doing it that way wasn't really the way to go. So he had this kind of situation. What I would do is suggest that when you look at this book, to really think about the kinds of experiences he's had going into subjects like the Empire of the Wheels series, the UFO file, and things, and then imagine the strange experiences he's had in relation to it, having been part of the Air Force, etc. This is very interesting stuff, and I can tell you just the chapters that I read are very off the charts. He's not holding back. It goes mystical on one hand, and on the other hand, it gets very deep into technology and ancient technology, and that's really where that's going to meet up with this episode well. So while he's wrestling, and I know it's not easy, while he's wrestling with his technology issues, and by the way, let me know if you see Gigi out there.
Okay.
While he's doing that, we are going to keep moving here, looking into this connection with Jessup and Cayce and Valentine, which I think as we add that to the picture, we're in a completely different spectrum about what this is all about. This is the article that I referenced earlier, which is Illiterate Man Becomes a Doctor When Hypnotized. This doctor here is Wesley Ketchum. Ketchum is quite fascinating. 4 years before he died in 1968, he wrote Bringing Edgar Cayce Public, where he talks all about his experiences and the resistance in the medical industry. But I've always felt there was something unusual about Ketchum and his ability to tune into the fact that Cayce had something going on. After all, he was a medical doctor, and he had no reason to trust Cayce any more than any of these other doctors. One of the things that he did was he brought him to New York to have all these tests done. And as it turned out, the test doctors who were looking at him and the reporters decided to kind of have a little fun when Cayce was in trance. They were like, he's not really in trance. Here's what we'll do. We'll poke him and prod him, and we'll stick a needle underneath his nails, and he'll yell, and then we'll know the whole thing is a fake. This was the level that these people were on. They were not ready to handle the strange powers that he was exhibiting. Now, Ketchum had already seen him diagnose at a distance a number of cases psychically using this psychic intuitive diagnosis. And as a result, we really were looking at a situation where Ketchum was the one who was introducing Cayce to this broader medical world. The broader medical world wanted to reject him. And so when they were doing these tests, Cayce basically shut off. He basically stopped speaking. And then about an hour later got up and realized what had been done to him, saw the blood under his nails and everything, and vowed never to deal with the medical establishment again. And I don't blame him. Of course, his readings now stand up more than ever. And if we see the work that he was doing in the 1920s now, it's almost 100 years ago, and the stuff is incredibly advanced, and most of the things that he was working on came to pass. So this is the nature, I think, of the beast when it comes to this. Now, I see what Walter popped up there temporarily.
Yeah,
okay.
He's desperate.
Okay, no, we don't. We can't do an audio thing. This is a video platform. Your link does work, however, though, because I tested it earlier and you showed up. So whatever it is on that. If you have either a laptop or something else to use, certainly the link will work because it already came through. So we're going to keep on with that. We can't stop the show and do a big troubleshooting session. That won't be very fair to everyone. But we will get you on. You have the link that will work. So we can always
Everybody share the vision.
Yes, it's going to come to pass.
Make it happen.
Yeah, and I want to mention to Walter, if you're listening, you were there, you were at it. It's just there was no video coming through, which means my guess is that it was the browser that's on the iPhone. So use a regular laptop and use Firefox. If Chrome gave you a problem, they certainly will do it. There are instructions also for the site StreamYard. If you go there, you can see instructions for adding yourself. So that we'll be here. You know how the shows goes. This is early for us. Everyone, you're watching the X Series episode 70. And we're going to have Walter Bosley joining us. There's some tech issues.
It is going to happen.
He's coming together with it. He's got the link. And we know that he did show up here in our queue. So certainly his video will pop open on that. If for any reason we can't get him on tonight, we'll do maybe we'll do a session tomorrow night to get him on and work with it.
Yep.
But we're going to keep on doing it. Walter says, "Oh, laptop is a pain for me." Well, I think that laptop might be the way to go. So if it takes a little bit extra, I probably would give it a shot, frankly. I think because I've noticed that the phone issues, that's where I think the issues would generally come from. Okay, so we're going to move forward at this point. And I want to point out that if you are, the first thing I want to suggest actually is to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for the newsletter. Now, the newsletter is interesting because it's a free newsletter, but it lets you know about once a week what shows are coming up and some of the subjects we're going to be touching on. It also tells you in advance about events that we have coming up. And this is going to be very important as we get into the next couple of months because there's some very interesting things happening, and we're going to be offering people who are on that list the chance to participate. They're very exciting things. I think some people can guess what they are. But we're going to be offering that to the people who are on that newsletter list. Of course, our members who support the show will get the first ability to have access to those tickets. We have something very, very special coming up. Now, I do want to also suggest that when you sign up for the newsletter, if you become a member, this is the time to do it, because you want to be able to support the show and get behind the kind of work that we're doing here. We have incredible guests also coming up for you, even through now to the end of 2019. It is an incredible roster, so you're going to want to be in on those episodes. Miss Olivia, how is it going out there?
Good. Let me ask this question from Najat.
Yes.
Are they hiding the technology to protect us, control us, or using it against us?
Well, the they part is interesting. I think you have to think about the two groups, X Protect and X Share, and then think about the mystery schools behind them. So the X Share mystery schools would be like the theosophical, anthroposophical bent, which are trying to move the culture forward and have an incredible track record and have been there every step of the way guiding humanity, so that things like the founding of America and, the major breakthroughs that we've made over time, largely responsible for, these groups are largely responsible for it. Going back to the New Atlantis craze from Francis Bacon, etc. So we can keep that in mind as we go. Next up, though, is when we think about the other group, we have to really, I think the best identification of what the mystery schools are and where they reside is in the Rudolf Steiner lectures and books. Now, Steiner, as the leader of anthroposophy, which was spiritual science, had come out of theosophy and had been the kind of the point man for Annie Besant in Germany. So they had a close relationship, and he was under her umbrella for over 5 years. So that's a very, very tight relationship. And she had spotted him out in Germany as someone who could do this. Now, he also had his own spiritual breakthroughs around this period of time. He was getting offered this chance. So it's really that interface between those two. Now, eventually they part company, but that's largely due to this whole thing about what they were trying to do with Krishnamurti, setting him up as kind of a savior, which is interesting because you can kind of appreciate that the mystery schools and Annie Besant, they were trying to do something which Blavatsky and others had predicted would be in this century. So, and Steiner himself predicted that this would have an opportunity if the mystery schools failed in 1917. This would have an opportunity, a window in 100 years. And that window, we think about 3 decades of that window. So we're in that window right now. It opened about 2016, 2017, and it's taking us all the way through to 2047. That's the window where we're going to make this difference. So when we think about those groups being in charge of this advanced technology, there's a group in there that wants to get their hands on it and use it the same way, if you kind of look at the Cayce work, that the Belial group used the two-eye stone. So it is, now we're starting to see in real time this play out. It makes a lot more sense, because when Cayce was talking about it in his era, it almost looked like it was maybe an explosive science fiction tale, because it's like, he's talking about flying through mountains, and they had the ability to dematerialize, and, they had flight, and they had the ability to contact higher spiritual sources in the outer sphere, as Cayce talks about it, through their two-eye crystal. So it'd be kind of like open up your laptop and deal with an ascended master to get advice for the day. That's how they were using it. So the legacy from that, through all those years of the mystery schools carrying forward, Pythagoras, the later schools, the Hermetic schools, all that training, we get down to the Gurdjieff work and the things that he brought forward about the mystery schools, the Essenes that created the school of the prophets. They've been trying for a long time to advance humanity. It hasn't always been working out so well. And we're come to a point where they understood, because of the impact, the influence of the scientific materialism, which Steiner clocks from 1840. So we know when this really kicked into high gear. That's when they decided, the mystery schools that wanted to move the culture forward, we have to let this out. But there were other schools, there were left-hand schools, Najat, and the left-hand schools operate very closely, according to Steiner, they operate very closely with the political situation in America. So there's a lot of left-hand school activity. And so America's leading the world, quote unquote, leading the world. There is this idea that we have the ability to really have this major breakthrough, but because of the left-hand schools, we're in a regressive pattern, and the society is becoming like a junk culture. So if you don't turn that around, you know, maybe there's a crash and the pendulum swings back. That could quite possibly be.
I have another question for you.
Yes.
Todd Wood wants to know, do you think X-Protect will ever give up?
Well, it's kind of like saying, do you think that the devil will ever, I mean, X-Protect is a function, and the system or the function there is going to be really hard. Let's see if we got Walter here. I just see it. It's kind of a good question. Oh my God. I see the video spinning, and Walter, there he is. Lo and behold. Can you hear me, Walter? I can't hear you so well, but I hear something out there. Well, at least we got you. Okay. Now,
we had audio before.
Okay, well, I'm starting to hear you. I'm starting to hear you better. So far, so good. Yes. Well, no, I'm not hearing you. But you know what you can do, actually, is, yeah, try it without plugging in. Just remove the headset entirely. And see if you can just talk directly through the mic. Okay, so we're not getting audio signal for you. I would do the whole. It's great. He's having a good. There he is. He definitely. I can see you, Walter. This is a good thing. It's good to see you, by the way.
Yeah, I don't know what the.
Yes,
yikes.
you sound good. You sound good. You sound good.
You guys realize that there's roughly anywhere from 5 to 10 shows guys like me do, right? I'm not kidding. Every single show uses a different system, and they say, "Oh, just load that system up on your laptop."
No, listen. I'll tell you what. The beautiful thing about this is we can hear you.
You hear me and not see me, or see me and not hear me?
No, you're fine. You're fine.
You got both now?
Yes, you're so
Okay.
so far so good.
Okay, I don't know why we're getting the lag in the video like that. Usually this kind of thing works better even on this stupid
I don't even
laptop.
think that's going to bother anybody, actually.
Okay, good. Yeah, I was sitting in the audio room at 6 o'clock, right on time for a change, and I realized, something's not working. Oh, wait a minute.
No, we appreciate the super effort. That's the nice thing. Walter, you sent me some chapters in that book, your new book.
Yeah.
My first question for you, and now that we have you here, it's great to see you. My first question for you is the book available yet?
Well, I was hoping to have made it available before coming on here, but gosh, speaking of computers, my PDF conversion software, which has been working beautifully all year, arbitrarily decided to be a pain in the butt. So it looks like I'll be getting that up late tonight.
Nice.
But definitely by tomorrow. So, oh, by the way, before anything, you kind of blown my mind with mention of, I didn't know that Harvey Firestone and Firestone was kind of in the mix on the stuff you're doing. Shortly after my dad got out of the Air Force under the weird circumstances that I talk about in my book, Shimmering Light, honorable discharge, everything great. They loved him. He went to work for Firestone. He worked for them for a number of years and was working for them in San Diego when I was born. So I find it interesting that with my dad's weird background, almost the first place he went right to working. In fact, he might have gone straight to Firestone after the Air Force And then I hear you saying that Harvey Firestone's in the mix with this weird stuff. It makes me wonder if that's how he got, if they said, okay, when he gets out, we'll send him to Firestone. You know, I don't know. Just a
A quick thing is, I think my speaker on your side is feeding back. You can hear me okay? Can you lower me on your side a little bit?
I think I should be able to do that. We're right over here. Yeah.
Yeah, just turn
Let me
down
see.
the volume.
I'm
Perfect.
trying to
Because you sound good.
Mhm.
the button. Oh, there we go. It's taking a little while.
Perfect. A quick thing is, your dad, interestingly enough, one of the things that he comes into is that, and correct me if I'm mistaken, but wasn't he fed this story, or didn't he get this idea that they had seen a UFO from a lost civilization?
What about the UFO from a lost civilization?
That your dad had seen one from a lost civilization?
Oh, no. What it is he was at Gunner Air Force Base getting advanced training, and he and a couple of guys he worked with were told they had to go to, it was either Kelly or Randolph in Texas. And when the plane took a northward bank over Mississippi, and a guy came out and said, "You ain't going to Texas. You're going to Wright-Patterson." And it was there that he and those guys got briefed in on Roswell. And then they were told the reason that they were getting briefed in was because what had happened at Roswell, it happened again, is what they told him. And he was part of, according to his memory, he was part of a retrieval op of a live pilot from this other civilization, and a human civilization, just a little different than us as far as the differences could be explained by the environment in which they lived. Apparently they were subterranean, so there was a difference in the hair on their bodies for some reason and stuff like that. But that is that was his experience. It was encountering this subterranean civilization. But in my book, I do have to explore the possibility that that was an MK Ultra layer put over his conscious memory to suppress the memories of an actual operation. So I go into that extensively because the Air Force was really deep and enthusiastic about MK Ultra during the 50s. They were the one branch that was the most excited about MK Ultra, and they were the one branch that developed their own MK Ultra program. And in 1973, when the CIA had to testify about MK Ultra, the DoD and the Air Force were not called before Congress to testify to what they had been doing with it for almost 20 years. For all we know, they still use MK Ultra. And I found it interesting when in training as an OSI agent, to be an OSI agent, they informed us that there were agents who were psychiatrists available for us to use in our investigations, and hypnotism was one of the tools that we had access to if we wanted to put someone under. So
fascinating. Did your dad think that the craft was from a lost civilization?
Yeah, he believed to the day he died that what he encountered and what he was told about was that it's a civilization that coexists with us on this planet. They are subterranean, primarily, as far as here. They, of course, have the capability, to leave the planet. But yeah, he told that story, as it was the God's honest truth. And I don't really say that it wasn't the truth, but, I had to be as objective as possible, even though it was my dad. I'm a professional criminal investigator and I had experience in the Air Force with that stuff. So I had to acknowledge that with MK Ultra methods, it is possible, very possible, It's part of why they did what they did when they created the whole thing, to put a false narrative in someone's mind, to cover classified activity. And think about it, you might want to put something kind of wild and not believable to most people, so that when the hypnotic suppression breaks down after so many years, and I was told by a superior officer that they used hypnotic suppression on my dad. And as you know, as the years go by and it begins to break down, that's when the false narrative theoretically would emerge. So they would tell this wild story of the false narrative. So it's kind of a double layer of protection covering what they were really involved with. So then you got to ask yourself, as I ask in the book Shimmering Light, what could he have been working on that was so deeply important? It wasn't just missile silos, that kind of thing. I think that when you look at the evidence for classified human space program, or secret space program, as we call it, there's historical evidence that that's exactly what the Air Force was working towards and doing in the 50s. So it's very possible that, because my dad worked on Mercury before it was NASA, that that's what my dad was working on. It's what we would call the secret space program, but the real one, that the more realistic, practical one, not the one of the ridiculous stories and whistleblowers. And because it was the Cold War, and America wouldn't want anyone to know how close to or how far into space we were venturing at that time, this would be considered probably the utmost secret. So therefore, it would justify using the MK Ultra suppression and false narratives. If that's the case, the other possibility is that he's telling the truth, and there is this other civilization on this planet with us. And there's always the third possibility, is that both are true, that they used MK Ultra, to maybe suppress the others, exposure to the other civilization. So it's kind of a take your pick shell game.
Well, it's very interesting. When I think about this, I think about some of those stories that we hear in relation to Mount Shasta, that, the Lemurians with their advanced technology, they went onto Mount Shasta, and once in a while people see them, or once in a while they come out and sort of influence the culture and go back under. There is that kind of wave, and the one group that you've brought up in the new book, and I have the cover of the new book. Can I show that cover?
Sure, please do.
There it is. Let's take a good look at this. This is Walter's new book, Confessions of a Spooky Mind. This is a spooky book already, I can tell you. That's one of your graphic jobs, too. I can tell, Walter. You've got that kind of stylistic action going on. Tell us a little bit about the book and why you decided to write something that reads almost autobiographical.
Well, and I'm so glad that we're talking about Morris Jessup, because it's perfectly resonant with this book. And what's interesting is, you asked me to be on far enough back. I was actually working on a different book, and I jumped rails to this book a few weeks ago. And so it's cool that this book I jumped to is right in line with the Morris Jessup stuff. So it's kind of like synchronicity there.
Big time.
I am a fan of and really love, and what got me into this field we're in are books like John Keel's Mothman Prophecies. And are you kidding me?
That's a book
Sorry, Mom.
right now. They want exclusive rights.
It's my mom. I'll call her. Sorry about that. I forgot to turn the ringer off. Jiminy. So I'm a fan of John Keel's work, like we all are. But, I'm also a big fan of, regardless of whatever degree some of it is, not exactly true or whatever. I'm a big fan of Gray Barkers. They knew too much about flying saucers.
Oh, yeah.
I love that era of the spooky research, before everything, before the overwhelming popularity of the ET meme, when, people would still look at and acknowledge the weirdness in these things. I talk in the book about how the Men in Black have changed from, or maybe I did that on my stream. I think in both, how we went from what the first witnesses of experiences with Men in Black, and I think Jessup was part of that, being something really much more mysterious than just federal agents trying to silence people. And because of the overwhelming growing addiction to the ET hypothesis, people just latched on to it's federal agents trying to silence ET presence, and they don't want to hear about the actual original reports of the Men in Black and what they really are. So it's that kind of stuff, and my own personal experiences are in line with that kind of weird stuff, including my UFO sighting in 2014. But the fact that within a month or two, a couple of months after I was born, we moved back to West Virginia, where my dad's was from. He's from Parkersburg, and we were living in Mineral Wells when the Woody Dernberger Mothman stuff was going on.
Oh, wow.
And I talk about this in the book and the family connection to all of this. Couple of degrees from Woody Dernberger, you would say, but this was in my background in my childhood. When I was a kid, they would use Miss Indrid Cold as kind of a boogeyman, to scare the kids to not stay out in the woods after dark, that kind of thing. And I grew up with that before I ever heard of John Keel and the Mothman Prophecies. So when I see this book and I read that in the mid to late 70s, I'm blown away, because I told my mom and dad, I'm like, this book's all about that, Woody Dernberger and all that Mr. Cold stuff. And they're like, oh, wow, we didn't know, And so because a lot of stuff in my past and my own experiences, particularly during this last decade or so working on Empire of the Wheel, is all in that weird category, and I've talked about some of it, I decided that, what, it's time to go ahead and, write my weird John Keelian Gray Barkarian kind of strange experience book, to get it down, on paper. And I figured it just felt right. I thought about writing this book a few times and started and then stopped, because I really thought, as I'm somebody with a strong ego. Okay. I have no self-esteem issues, but I still felt, that, nobody wants me to really write a book about me. So, after 10 nonfiction books about other figures and other things, I finally, it just clicked right. And I said, okay, I'm going to do this. And I still think people might hate it. They might read it and go, Bosley's nuts. I'll wait till he comes out with another Napoleon book or something. But it just seemed right. And there are some things in the book that I've never discussed publicly that might get people's attention. I don't know, but it's a very personal book, so for personal reasons I wrote it.
Yeah. Well, let's do this. I'm going to give you a couple of questions around the book from the chapters that you sent me, which is very interesting stuff. But before I get there, actually, I want to ask you, when you're talking about this period, this kind of mystical period, when the Men in Black show up, when Gray Barker is talking about strange things that happen, there's almost like a kind of paranormal aspect to the UFO apparitions and the stories. Even Menninger's stories is very strange. He starts hearing music in his head, and he drives to a cabin, and there are these basically Pleiadians there. Very different from Gray abduction stories. What is it about those stories that resonates? It's almost like that had to be cut out and gotten rid of in a way, but there's something kind of palpable about the psychic, mystical aspect of the UFO phenomena.
Yeah, I think it's because it scares a lot of people, for one thing. People don't know what to do with that facet of the whole UFO thing. They don't want to hear it. ET phone home, and the happy little childlike beings who will come down like in Close Encounters and take you away to La La Land. That's so much more comfortable. We have Steven Spielberg to thank for a lot of this stuff. And that's because it is more palatable for people. Look, we're in an age where people are really into angels, the lore of angels, right? And they study this stuff and they talk about it, and they even, in some cases write about it. But you'll hear a lot of these people, the phrase that will come out of their mouth is, "Oh, I believe in angels, but I don't believe in demons. I don't believe in the devil. There's no such thing as demons. There's only angels and light." And I just, you kind of go, what do you think demons were? You can't have one without the other, if you're being honest. But I, I think it scares people. I think it's definitely there, and they just don't know what to do with it. If you ask actual people who have experienced and had real contacts, you find out that there's usually an element of this weird stuff that they just don't know what to do with it, unless they're a scholar of it, or they're aware of it going into it, and then they recognize things. Like in my UFO sighting, I totally recognized certain connections, and they're there. It's just the way it is. Now, does that mean I can conclude that that's who and what it was? No, I can't for certain. But boy, the context is definitely there, and it's just people don't know what to do with it. It freaks them out.
There's no question. I think there's been an incredible degeneration from the work. If you look at the work of somebody like Jessup, who's talking very extensively about Atlantis and other theories, rolling this in, and then, we've had this push on one side of these kind of crazy, wild stories of people being ambassadors and all that kind of stuff. I'm a galactic ambassador. I'm Cayce reincarnated, whatever it is. And then we have this big push now that's on with the To the Stars Academy, which is all like, hey, we're rolling in with these metamaterials and $50 million in funding and all that. It's a bunch of junk. I mean, it's got nothing to do with real UFO research. How do you get back on that track? And some of the stuff that you're doing, I think, is taking a totally different approach when looking at it and bringing in some of those elements.
Well, I think what you have to do is start looking at it case by case again. And when you look at UFOs case by case, you don't think about all the nonsense, the disclosure, the politics of it. You don't think about the who's a star, who's not, who said what, this, that, and the other. You're looking at the case. You're looking at the details of a sighting, and you're focusing on that. And what you often find, this is why I come from the angle I come from on it, and have gone down the road I go with it, is you see stuff that does not fit in the standard popular ET hypothesis. That's why there's several of us out here who we're opposed to this idea that the ET hypothesis explains them all, because they certainly don't. Because when you look, the closer you look, you find other things besides the ET hypothesis. And so it's kind of frustrating when you're up against the general public in the community that it's all about ETs, it can only be about ETs. Well, no, there's more going on here. And yet I totally believe that the ET stuff is happening. I think maybe that what we need to do is we might need to not put the emphasis on flying in an aerial in UFOs. We might need to start classifying the whole thing in a different way, because clearly there are three possibilities I can think of right off the bat that the way that it manifests includes flight. Okay, But it's like I say in the book, rain comes from the sky and ash can fall from the sky, but they're not the same thing and they don't come from the same source, right? Ash comes from a fire or a volcano or something like that. Rain, we know what that is. But the way people look at UFOs, oh, it comes out of the sky, so it must be an ET, right? Or no, the ash is the rain is the ash because they both come from the sky. So it's that kind of logic you see people doing when it's ET versus a non-ET explanation. So I think maybe we have to kind of relabel the whole thing to begin with. But really, to get back to what we're talking about in what you said, as far as getting back to the real study of it, getting rid of all the side nonsense, I think the answer is case by case. Just go back and look at each case and analyze each case on its own merits. And I think that's a good remedial path for, whatever ufology is.
Wow, well, it's a great point. It really needs it. No, too, that's for sure. One of the things I want to point out is, while you have such a great grasp of some of those more unusual cases, you mentioned Indrid Cold actually in the whole Mothman thing, which has all kinds of paranormal things going on left and right, along with the UFO sightings. What did you think of the Indrid Cold story, and can you describe what that is for people?
I love it. I love that stuff. Remember, I started hearing about Mr. Cold from the time I can first remember hearing about him. I was a young child when that was happening, okay? And it happened right before we returned to California when I was a young child. And then we went back to West Virginia one more time because my dad couldn't stay away from trying to go back home. So he tried it a second time between 1973 and 1975. And it was during those years that we lived next door to an older couple, the Sarters, Hilda and Peanuts. That I never knew his real name. It was his nickname, Peanut. They were friends with my grandparents and neighbors of my dad when he was a kid growing up. So they knew my grandparents, and their daughter, Darla, is mentioned in chapter 9 of Keel's book, The Mothman Prophecies. She's one of the witnesses of, the weird stuff. And she became friends with Dernberger. So I grew up, especially those 2 years in West Virginia, I would hear firsthand stories about Woody Dernberger, comments and things like that. And Indrid Cold, as I said, was the boogeyman. And when you go back and look at what Dernberger originally said and his experience with Mr. Cold, with Indrid Cold, for me, I can't buy the subsequent stories that, but Indrid Cold ended up moving to a town in Pennsylvania, and so went and talked to him, or Indrid Cold was a member of this gang family, crime family, and no, the stuff after Dernberger really smells like what Adam Go-Rightly pointed out a few years back, that federal agents and other con men had figured out that they could use this Indrid Cold thing, for a cover or use for their stuff. So when, for starters, you've got to go back to Woody Dernberger's experience and what Woody Dernberger said about him. And what is that, as you ask, because not a lot of people know. Essentially in 1967 or 66, late 66, I think, Woody Dernberger's driving home from work. He worked in Marietta, Ohio, and he was on, I believe, Highway 77, coming back, and he lived in Mineral Wells. And it's a rainy night, and coming up the highway, he sees this object, this large object, and a man standing by it. And he pulls over, and the man walks up to his car. And as he's walking up to his car, the object goes straight up in the air. And he looked up, and it was maybe about, I think, 50 feet or something up there, just kind of waiting as this man who he described as kind of, dark-haired, dusky-colored skin, walked up to the passenger side window and had a conversation with him, speaking English. He asked him, what's that town over there? He didn't say town, he said gathering. And it was basically for all the world, an encounter with a guy not from our world. And he had a couple more encounters with him. He allegedly was taken to this Mr. Cold's world, which was called Lanalos. And he described it as a jungle, tropical environment. Well, that right there is very loaded. Indrid Cold's name is loaded. John Keel pointed out, and Andrew Colvin has done really the best further research and extrapolation of the idea that Mothman was possibly a Garuda, which is from Hindu mythology. It is a bird creature, the flying mount of Vishnu, I believe, or Indra. You have Indrid Cold, whose first name sounds suspiciously East Asian, East Indian. And you have Woody at one point being taken to this tropical environment. So was Woody really taken to another planet? Or was he taken to India or Thailand or maybe even South America? Some people said he was taken to, one of the secret Nazi bases in South America. I guess, that's possible. I would look at India or Thailand. And the reason I say that is because the myth that India, Thailand, Cambodia, and Indonesia, they share a mythology. And the Garuda, for example, is very prominent in that. So here you have this winged cryptid creature being called the Mothman, doing this stuff back there. At the same time, you have Indrid, kind of the dusky skinned, darker guy with dark hair with this suspiciously in East Indian first name. And you have him taking away, one of the witnesses to this tropical jungle territory. So to me, you've definitely got something going on that is not a typical ET UFO man from another planet story. You have something else entirely going on, but that's the basics of the original story. I apologize if I got some little details wrong, but that's the actual basics of the original Dernberger story. And then of course you had the Mothman stuff going on in Point Pleasant. Mothman was appearing at different places, scaring the hell out of people. They would have weird physical reactions. Their eyes would get red and such. And he seemed to be a harbinger of doom. And sure enough, in Christmas season, I can't remember if it was Christmas Eve, I think, in '66. Was it Christmas Eve?
Yep.
The Silver Bridge collapsed and several people died. It's depicted, really the film The Mothman Prophecies, even though it takes a few liberties with the story, it's actually an excellent film. I found The Mothman Prophecies to be the movie that both X-Files films wish to God they had been and weren't. It really is a very good movie and captures the feel of it. But yeah, what you had going on, it's a story of high strangeness. It's a story of, mythological depth. It's a story of, time and strangeness. It's not a story of, a man from another planet. And
Wow. Yeah, absolutely fascinating. And it's amazing. It's so good to have you talking about the Mothman case, that entire Indrid Cole aspect and the amazing things that were happening there in 1966, and that John Keel was showing up as a reporter in the middle of it. He's just going through these unusual things that are happening. I have a question for you related to that case, which is, during that period of time when he's traveling there, Keel, he's coming down from New York and going to this Point Pleasant, he's getting calls that are telling him about things that are going to happen the next day. And he says they sound like they're disembodied, almost electronic voices that are calling him on the phone. Did you have any idea what that's all about?
Well, you can have an idea, but that's the thing about that whole story and stories like that is you just can't be sure. Now, when it comes to knowing things that were going to happen, you have to look at it's been a while since I read that particular book. You have to look at the individual things that the caller said this is going to happen, and you have to say, okay, was this thing something that was in the realm of a person being able to make that happen? Or was this thing in the realm of that's not something that a person can just go instruct somebody to do something? Now, that said, I don't know that anyone has ever considered, that I've heard, if I'm wrong, I would love to read it, but I don't know if anyone's considered sabotage in the case of Silver Bridge. I've never heard that brought up. Everybody brings up, the weirdness of they knew it was going to collapse. Well, maybe they knew it was going to collapse because somebody did it on purpose.
Right.
Of course, that gets into why in the hell would somebody do something like that, which is a whole other discussion. But I've just never heard anybody comment or bring up the notion that the bridge could have been sabotaged. And there apparently are, there's these photos that are apparently the Mothman seen on the bridge. Well, was it the Mothman or was it somebody up there undoing bolts? You have to, as an investigator, professional investigator, that's one of the things I would have to ask is, okay, let's look for any signs of sabotage, any inflicted damage. So in that, there's that category of, okay, these alleged predictive calls, precognitive calls, is the stuff they're predicting stuff that somebody could order to be done? Okay, we'll put that in that category. And then there's the other thing, is it something that is not readily something that could be just ordered? And again, you have to take each one. Now, there is the issue of apparently, I know guys like to have a lot of fun messing with each other, but in the big picture, it's no help when you had guys apparently like Jim Moseley and Gray Barker, doing crank calls on Keel and each other and stuff. And when you find that out, you kind of you just go, oh, really, guys? It's funny, but it's not funny because it then makes it almost impossible to even intelligently comment on something, because you start saying, well, what about this weird call? And then you find out that, Moseley admitted to that or Barker admitted to that. And you just want to say, from an investigative standpoint, you just kind of want to throw your hands up and say, well, you got these jagoffs over here that were messing with stuff. So now we don't know, everything's tainted. Now we don't know what would have been a legit call or not, because these guys were just having a blast. And, so that whole thing is there's enough murk in the whole Mothman thing. With the Indrid Cold thing, with him, the murk came later when other people wanted to get in on the act. That's the other problem is, people that just want to get in on the act, and they can come in and cause more murkiness. So you have to go back to that original stuff, which is why I advocate go back to what Woody Dernberger himself initially said about Indrid Cold, and that's going to be likely your purest data. Kind of like with the Sonora Aero Club, you always, and NIMSA, you always kind of have to go back to Delshow because he's the first guy from whom we learn this stuff. You got to go back to.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's fascinating. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're here in episode X70. I'm just about to ask Walter Bosley about X Protect and Men in Black and this ilk, and if that comes up in his book at all. There is one figure there prominently on the cover. The new book that he has is Confessions of a Spooky Mind. I'm going to show this picture again because I think it really kind of captures this vibe. And this new book is going to be available this weekend. Walter has just got it out. Of course, it's coming on the heels of Esoteric Napoleon, which is a fantastic work. This is in a totally different area, but gets more into the things that we're talking about now. And I want to also mention that we're going to be taking questions here, Miss Olivia.
Mhm.
And now that we've sorted things out, and if you want to ask questions for Walter, ask them in all caps, and we'll get to them shortly here. But how's it going out there, Miss
It's going
Olivia?
great. I want to say right away that everyone loves the cover of the book. So congratulations.
Aces.
Mhm.
Walter, the question I have for you is, when we talk about things like the Men in Black, and we talk about what Donald Kehoe called the Silence Group, which was a group which I think is a reference to what I'm calling Expertech, who can employ means to just eliminate people, like Jessup was eliminated for knowing too much. But then the Men in Black have unusual properties. And so you mentioned Keel, and one of the things I bring up very often is that when he showed people the picture of the person that was being seen showing up in these Men in Black encounters, he was looking for what particular race or some characteristic that would identify them. And over again, they chose this Sami person. And he was using this classic photo that I usually show and keep around. But and then when I went into the history of the Sami, those very early Laplander, that early group, were really renowned for having these supernatural abilities. And then I started to wonder, is that what we did adopted in these groups? And that's what Expertech has, which is this almost like astral agency that they're putting forward. How do you identify an Expertech silence group type Men in Black aspect? Where do they fit into a traditional, say, CIA setup?
Well, just like, we've discussed a lot that there are different sources and ways to identify a UFO. I think, it's obvious that there are multiple groups going around doing their version of a silence group, their version of Men in Black, for their own reasons. The federal agents, in suits, wanting people to not talk about what they saw. That one's easy to figure out. They're just trying to keep classified technology classified. And despite the popular horror stories you hear about them threatening people and being mean, actually, when you look more closely at these cases, and you find out that really the cases that you read out there, they were asking, people to be good citizens. The Air Force agents would go to someone and say, hey, we're try to be a good citizen. This is for national security. We'd love for you to not talk about this. You find more often than you hear about stories like that. But then you do have this particular group you're talking about. So you got to say, do they know what these things are by virtue of their society being in more physical proximity to the activity of these things, right? Are they somehow associated with whoever and whatever the source of these things are? So, they're serving, some function there with them, for them. And then you have the Indrid Cold type. Maybe those people were right about the Nazi association in South America. Maybe some of these people are working on behalf of them to keep their stuff quiet, or at least back then they were. Because remember, now we have reason to suspect possibly that Adolf Hitler lived until 1973. So, with the Bureau taking seriously into the 60s, sightings of Adolf Hitler being reported, we now know that's true. This stuff was going on in the 60s. So, let's look at it with the Joseph Farrell Nazi filter. Back in the 60s, that's only 20 years after the war. They really still want to be kind of, nothing to see here, folks. There's no Nazis here. So maybe they were using, some of these silence group people to help suppress too much inspection, their direction, too many eyes, their direction. So, you hear the extent to which I'm stumbling around trying to answer this, because this is still one of the greatest enigmas in this whole subject, is who are these guys? And the best I can do, and anyone can do, is what I'm doing is speculate, where they come from, who they're associated with, and then on top of that, speculate why they would want to serve that source or serve that, group or civilization. It's all speculation. And they have done a good job maintaining this this mystery about themselves. Then there's the whole gypsy connection to the thing, the whole gypsy culture issue that is in the mix. So here's the thing that begins to emerge: the idea that an ancient civilization has survived. I mean, a lost, let's call it a lost civilization, has indeed survived in this world with us, and these are their people, interacting with the people that have happened to encounter them. And you and I both know who's a good candidate to be that lost civilization, because their fingerprints and their landmarks are everywhere. So certainly in my UFO experience, their symbolism and their fingerprints were all over that. I talk about that in the book. So we come back to the Tuatha Dé Danann, whoever they are and whatever they really are. How much of it is this mysticism, this glamoury that they, we're fairies. We don't know. It at least in our position. So I personally think that the legitimate Men in Black stories, the Silence Group, is a group associated with some ancient culture, some hidden, lost in the past ancient culture. I think that's who and what they're affiliated with.
Fascinating. I'm glad you mentioned the Tuatha Dé Danann, because one of the things I was thinking about is we've done a few episodes on them and try to go deep, because they're in the hot zone. They're in Ireland. When they show up in Ireland, watch out. They're splitting up the islands the minute they get there, and they show up in a cloud. So there's a lot there. You really, they've shown up in your work a lot, crisscrossed. And in this book, in the chapters that you sent me, I saw that they were in there, and it was this idea of this advanced culture that had this technology and who were originally spacefaring and came here.
Yeah, I think that, space, maybe space-time faring. There is this not typically extraterrestrial thing about the Tuatha Dé Danann. And I don't know if that's just because they have the ability to take advantage of interdimensional technologies, and they just happen to be also from literally another planet. I think they're both. I think the Tuatha are, yes, from another planet, essentially, but they're not like your what we would call the standard ET civilization that would come here, because they've got that extra little bit of knowledge. So they're a different ball game. They're operating from a different angle, on a different level, and I think that's what causes a lot of just a regular ET civilization. It's like this. I tell people, particularly the people that are screaming for disclosure, I want disclosure now. They act like a bunch of children, and I get a lot of hate for this. That's why I like to, because it's easy to spin them up. But I tell people, look, how basic ET disclosure is going to happen is, if you haven't seen it, go get the movie Apocalypto and watch the last scene, because that's exactly how I think it's going to happen. We're going to be going about our business, blah, 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 and they're just going to drop in and show up on our shores. Hey, we're here.
Right.
That's going to be ET disclosure. All this activism and stuff, that ain't going to make it happen. But that's that thing. The Tuatha just feel like and seem like they're their own thing. And if you're talking interdimensional technologies, then that's the next level. Like, think of 2001: A Space Odyssey, the film. Yeah, they're astronauts. Yeah, they're on these ships. Yeah, they're going to Jupiter, and that's outer space travel. But then look what happens to David Bowman. He ends up going into the monolith and into this other dimension. You could argue that he's encountering perhaps the Tuatha, right? That they're the ones who. That's kind of what I suspect about them. That's what I see about them. They're acting like the intelligence in 2001 that planted the monolith, that allowed Bowman to go into the monolith and experience, the other dimension of space-time. That's the way I see them. I think they explain the Viracocha and Quetzalcoatl myths and all of that. And I think these true, mysterious, original reported Men in Black or Silence Group are their agents. I think they're their representatives, their associates.
Which would explain their supernatural abilities very well. One thing that's interesting to me when we've talked about this is that the Tuatha are interesting because they seem to have a supernatural aspect, and so they've been recorded as a kind of a mythical, part of the Celtic vision of Ireland. However, there are actual detailed records of the succession of kings of the Tuatha. So when we get into that, what happens, we have an actual recorded group here, but we also have this mythical aspect they've been turned into. That makes them unusual.
Here's what I think about that. You have the Tuatha as they came down from the sky, another dimension, and they come down. It's the initial encounter that's described in the ancient tales and all that, and then after they begin to influence human tribes. Okay, these kings and those dynasties and things like that. Those are their human agents. Okay, that's like the next era of the Tuatha. That's after they've arrived from wherever their world, their reality is. That's when they've started setting up kind of representative tribes of their culture, okay, of them, of their thing. So when people go all anthropological on me and say, no, it's just all anthropology, it's all just tribes from the Middle East, I argue, no, it's not. There's the group that came from another world, okay, and all these ones that the anthropologists want to point to explain away the Tuatha. Those are the it's like when in The Man Who Would Be King and Alexander the Great in real life, when they would go and conquer, right, they would absorb who they conquered into their own army. That's what the Tuatha did. They came from another world, another dimension, and they kicked butt because they were met with resistance. And then after they kicked their butts pretty handily, they said, okay, now, we actually want to be your friends, be on our side, be our representatives. So I think that explains the dynastic lines that you're talking about. So both are true. The otherworldly origin of them, the actual real Tuatha, and then their human representatives here on Earth. I think that's the explanation for that.
Wow, it's fascinating. They are an incredible group. What's interesting is you discovered when you were thinking about it, they showed up in book after book after book that I did. When I look at it, they're strewn through all the work. So I find that very interesting. One thing I want to ask you about them is when you think of a group like that and you think of the echo, even the name, there are elements in it, like the Two-Eye Stone, for example, that Casey talked about that powered Atlantis is TUAOI. Their name is TUA, that starts with the same TUA. So I found that's an interesting crossover. Let's go with them just as an idea, as remnants of this advanced Atlantean culture moving around, still keeping the technology. They're the ones who kept it. How does that work when we're looking at a group like this?
Well, I think we have the answer in those stories of Quetzalcoatl and Viracocha. It was something that now, of course, those happened after the fall of a civilization, and they, of course, came across the sea and helped rise up other civilizations. But it was the same model. I think this was their model. They came down to our world, or came to our world from wherever theirs actually is, and they clearly were much more advanced than anybody else here. And so they, it's the classic, they influence humanity, in all sorts of science and technology and craft and things like that in society. And, they brought up the humans that they found. And then those humans kind of start doing their own thing. And however long this lasts, it lasts long enough that the people after them, okay, you have the Tuatha, you have the civilizations they built up and helped, and then these last long enough so that when they fall, their descendants think of them as the originals, okay, and they think of Atlantis as, oh, it was the Atlanteans that were the great, brilliant, amazing ones, when actually it might have been that it was the Tuatha that taught the Atlanteans all that stuff, right? And that's how I'm seeing it. That's basically how I see it, because again, when you look at this, you see their fingerprints, you see this model, you see their landmarks, all over the place. So, in my opinion, it had to be them.
And lest anyone think we're taking a flight of fancy here, the Tuatha show up in Walter's new book, and they have popped up in his work quite a bit. And in the shows that we've done on them, what I've really found fascinating is the magical aspect mixed with this reality. They're clearly supernatural beings, quite different. One of the things they show up with are these gifts, Walter, and there's something called the Cauldron of Dagda, which I find fascinating. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, they came from their world, bringing 4 treasures from their 4 cities, is how it's described. And from these treasures, by the way, we get the 4 suits of a deck of playing cards. Okay, the clubs, the spades, the diamonds, and the hearts. These actually are derived directly from, when you trace it back, it goes all the way back. Its origin are these 4 treasures. One is the spear, one is the sword, one is the stone, and then there's the 4th one. I apologize. I always lose the 4th one because it has this, the way they describe it. But then you have their king, their leader, Dagda, who is known for his cauldron. And when he wants to put his blessing on a place, a people, or a person, he will manifest that cauldron and kind of spread his blessings. For instance, what I have found here in the San Bernardino Valley are what I think are Tuatha landmarks in our arrowhead, our giant arrowhead here on the side of the mountain. Actually looks more like a spearhead. And it was a mystery to the natives. People immediately want to say, well, that's Native American culture, and you're just appropriating that, well, no. The natives who were here came up with a wild story for the origin of that arrowhead, because they didn't put it there. Somebody put it there. The what I think is the sword is actually something that was placed originally it was wooden in the top of Mount Rubidoux in the 19th century. Okay, and the one that's there now, the replacement, is a mid 20th century thing. So it's my opinion that there is this culture associated with the Tuatha that is still putting these landmarks out there and still going around communicating in terms of Tuatha symbolism. If that answered your question.
Yeah, yeah. I got to tell you, whenever I go into the X series hot zone place, I come face to face with the Tuatha over and over again in the work of Egerton Sykes, who was a real intense British intelligence officer who was very, very deep on the Atlantis research, but is largely forgotten by those groups. He attributed everything to them, and he said it's all there in the Celtic history. You can get the entire hot zone Atlantis aspect by looking at that. And he attributed Bimini as Murius, one of the lands that they brought these gifts from. But when you talk about them, it's like you have a special resonance with the whole idea, and I like that.
Well, here's what I think. Here's where I'm at presently on this Tuatha symbols as landmarks. I think that the 4 treasures of the Tuatha they have something to do with their philosophy of civilization. Something to do with their philosophy of advanced, proper, their model of civilization. And so they will use these treasures as these landmarks. They will identify, for whatever reason, there are places that they will identify as either their territory or to maybe help us along in developing a particular area. They will, they or those who follow them will apply these symbols. So you ask, okay, why would these symbols be here in the San Bernardino Valley, which is the butt of many jokes in California, a state that's quickly, the whole state's becoming the butt of jokes, all over the country. And the Inland Empire and San Bernardino Valley is like the butt of the joke. Well, just like I discovered when I was researching the Empire of the Wheel stuff, this place used to be the garden spot of Southern California. Okay, this place fell like Eden fell. When you go back 100 years or more, the park that was at the former lake, where now we have a mall since 1967. Interesting that year. That used to be literally, I'm not exaggerating, that was the Disneyland. That was when people would come to Southern California, they wanted to come to San Bernardino. Los Angeles was nothing. It was a bunch of orange groves and ranches. At one time, this was the garden spot. And I personally think that the city, this valley, the Inland Empire, was assassinated. The place was assassinated. And they used the telluric current system. I talk a lot about the Empire of the Wheel books and my stuff, the telluric current system. And I think that's a clue as to why the Tuatha will select a certain place, because I think the Tuatha use the telluric system. I think wherever they go, they know how to look for it. They know where the flows are. And because certainly these landmarks I'm talking about are connected, according to Seshari's analysis and my analysis, these particular landmarks are connected to this telluric system that we've identified here. So I think that when they place their landmarks, their symbols, whatever these treasures were, it has something to do with enhancing or igniting, okay, turning on the system in a more turbo. It's kind of like turbocharging the system so that a civilization can flourish there. Just like this valley flourished for a while. It was amazing. It's incredible. Until somebody decided to turn that off. And I don't know if that's because they removed, possibly. It might be that the only reason that I can find and see 2 landmarks is because the other 2 were removed, were taken, and it shut the system off and therefore killed the San Bernardino Valley.
Can you describe this telluric system?
Well, telluric current is a real thing. You can Google it. It's an extremely low frequency that runs naturally through the planet. It's part of the process when a planet is terraforming, and it remains after the terrain has solidified. It's interesting. It's part of what shapes the terrain, and then when the terrain becomes solid, the telluric current continues to flow through that, through riverbeds or mountaintops or whatever the topograph topographical. There's topology and then there's topography. I can't mix those two up. So it's there and it can be tapped into. In the mid 19th century, the railroad, the guys building the railroad, they also brought into existence at the same time, hand in hand, telegraphy. Okay, telegraph systems, the old Morse code thing that you tap. And these guys knew that telluric current was there, and they would actually tap into the telluric current in the ground to enhance their telegraphic communications. Okay, and this is why the railroads were initially built along flows and lines of telluric current, because these telegraphers worked for the railroad. It was the railroad's telegraphy company, and they would identify where these lines were, and the railroads were built on these things. And what they discovered was, it enhances this radio or telegraphic technology in obvious ways. How else could it benefit, other technologies? Will, trains run smoother? Will things be more what's the word? I can't, firm and solid, particularly where there's, a lot of times there's earthquake activity. Is it smart to, build on the telluric currents because it'll, be more solid? Now, what's interesting is we got into the 20th century and technology advanced. You also find literal radio stations and radio towers also posted along the telluric current. Okay. You find hospitals and airports and military bases where the telluric current is. Okay. So with hospitals, it implies that it assists in healing. Okay. With radio, obviously, the functions of radio, in the early 1900s, the U.S. Navy developed ground radio, which is very Tesla-like. They'd stick an antenna or a pole into the ground, literally, and that's what it meant, ground radio. And it would enhance the function of the machinery. And of course, military bases and airports, for whatever reason. But it is there. It is something that, actual technicians and scientists will tap into and use. It's the thing that Nikola Tesla was tapping into. From my perspective and my research, what I discovered is that people were doing nefarious things along the lines of black magic. And it looks like the Zodiac Killer was aware of it and using that. In the first Empire of the Wheel book in chapter 23, I have a co-author on that one book. Rick and I present the evidence through Sechery's analysis that all of the known and even suspected Zodiac Killer victims were attacked, whether they were killed or not. They were attacked in places where the telluric current runs through. On the telluric current thing, the Zodiac Killer was attacking his victims by location. That's the one thing that connects them all. Nobody else has figured that out. I mean, they've looked at geography, but not in the right way. It has to do with this telluric current stuff. And we have Sherry Joe Bates, the murder site there, which is right over here in Riverside, across from where I live. When I give people the Empire of the Wheel tour, I always take them to the exact spot where Sherry Joe Bates was murdered by the Zodiac Killer. And there's telluric current, according to Sechery's analysis and stuff, running right through it. really creepy.
It's amazing. It's absolutely fascinating. And I think so much when you're talking about, wow, just it's mind blowing. But I think so much about things like ley lines. And, we're getting that whole sense of how they laid out these monuments, and then Cape Canaveral's on one of these. So we're really getting that whole vibe. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. I'm here with Walter Bosley, and we're talking about Walter's new book, which is absolutely fascinating, Confessions of a Spooky Mind. This is interesting because you can hear Walter when he goes into these various inspirations that he's had to do for his different book series, like The Empire of the Wheel or Esoteric Napoleon or Shimmering Light. He's drawing from his own experience and own interests, and he's kind of leading us into how he got there, and that's the kind of niche aspect of this book. One thing I want to make a point of now is we're going to switch over to some questions that for Miss Olivia to give to Walter. And you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is episode 70. We started off talking about X-Protect, and we got Walter's version of that too. And it is very interesting because it's the mystical aspect over and over again, whether we're talking about the Tuatha or if we're talking about the Men in Black, whatever it is, there's this extra kind of piece that goes along with the UFO aspect. That's crucial in understanding it, I would say. And that's something that Walter's bringing to the front with this. And boy, has that been a missing piece. And we see that people like Jessup, for example, who we started the show off with, they were taking it seriously. And I think that's a crucial piece. So we're going to take some questions here. I want to remind everyone, too, to go to thedarkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter to stay in touch with us. We've seen so many people just thrown off of the social media platforms. And so the best way to stay in touch is for us to have that pipeline. By the way, this book, Confessions of a Spooky Mind, is going to be available on Lulu. So I guess we're keeping up with Walter on his website. Where should we go, Walter?
For the book or for the book, my books are only available at lulu.com, lulu.com. I'm a print-on-demand small press publisher. Lulu's not the publisher. I'm the publisher. Lulu's just a printing and distribution service. That's how a lot of small press people use it. And it should be, if it's not up later tonight, it'll be up tomorrow. The best place to see my, what I'm doing regularly is my YouTube channel on Sunday nights at 5:30 Pacific time, p.m. Walter Bosley channel. But I do have empireofthewheel.blogspot.com, which there's some interesting essay posted there, and I will be updating that, of course, soon. But you can find all my books at Lulu.
That's where they are, and I highly recommend. I like the Empire of the Wheel series, Shimmering Light. These are great books. Miss Olivia, now we've had our fun. We've gone deep.
So we could be here for another 2 hours. There's so many great questions.
You're gonna have to consolidate it because we only have a small amount of time left. But go for it.
Okay, Aether. Walter, according to the Quetzalcoatl sayings, the feathered serpent will come back at another time. Are there any sayings of the Tuatha Dé Danann coming back to Ireland in future times?
Well, they did. They left and they returned. And here's what's interesting. Again, the name escapes me. There's a guy out there that wrote a couple of books, and he was the first one to put forth the correlation that about the time that the Tuatha disappeared from Ireland, from that area, all sorts of interesting things started happening in Latin America with the building of the megaliths and all this stuff. And then when those guys, who helped them, the Viracocha, Quetzalcoatl thing, when they disappeared from Latin America, turns out the Tuatha returned to Ireland. Okay. So, do the math there. It's clear to me that that's a great suggestion. And to what degree it's accurate, I will be looking closer at. But my understanding, when I kind of gave it, when I first heard that and gave it a glance, it appears to be accurate. So they seem to come and go. Now, whether they, I believe in the Quetzalcoatl and both Viracocha stories. Yes, they said they would return. And I think there was something similar with the Tuatha, but that's known. They did leave and then return, and then after that is when they really primarily went subterranean.
Yeah, it's interesting. When we get into that, one of the episodes we brought up that the tribe of Dan, is this unusual group in the Bible, and they have overtures and kind of undertones of the Tuatha too.
Yeah, I think they're one of those, tribes that was kind of a representative tribe that was under their aegis of the actual otherworldly Tuatha. That's an example of what I was talking.
Absolutely. Miss Olivia.
Nenny says, was Tesla using telluric currents, do you think?
Telluric.
Yeah, I think that was the grid he was talking about, was that telluric current system that you hear me talk about and others talk about. And I refer to Sechery's work. Yeah, I think that's exactly what it was.
Miss Olivia.
Okay. Todd Wood, what event influenced Walter Bosley the most in his paranormal experiences?
Ooh, influenced me the most. It was the experience I had at 16 years old on a Sunday morning in December of 1979. I woke up and everything was different. Really, it was me that was different, and not, in a coming of age way. This was weird. And that's when all the other weird stuff, much of what I talk about in the book, really began to happen. Precognitive dreams, just weird psychic sensitivities, kind of things. People get an impression that I'm some skeptical debunker who doesn't believe in anything, and that read this new book. This is why I wrote the book, Confessions of a Spooky Mind. You will see that is, au contraire, that I very much believe in these things. What I also believe in is identifying BS artists when I see them, and throwing the BS flag when it's necessary. Because unfortunately, in this realm of stuff we're all interested in here, there are liars and charlatans and fakers, and people that are not honest, and they don't help, they hurt. So that's why, and in recent years, we've had people out there that are hurting more than they're helping. That's why I've been vocal on that. But really, it was waking up and noticing that I felt out of place. I felt like for the longest time, I thought about this concept of a walk-in, that, wow, sometime in the night, I'm some other consciousness that walked into this body. Over the years and since then, I have a different hypothesis than that, but that wasn't far off the mark. Okay, and I talk about this in one chapter of the book. So that I still call that the singular most impactful, influential event of my entire life, in a lifetime of all sorts of weird stuff going on. But that I think was the most impactful, because I'm that person. I've been that inquisitive person who's been open and receptive and noticing the weird stuff since then. So I credit that.
Wow. Very, very, very interesting. I think it's, it's kind of fascinating too, because it is necessary when you get into these independent research to be able to spell things out. And we have so much of an industry now around the UFO thing that, when you see TTSA saying, hey, we have 50 million in losses, and the whole TV show on History Channel and stuff. I mean, it's like, that's a corporation trying to make a buck and whatever, but it doesn't have anything to do with, the kind of good factual research. They're more out there doing this operation. And then there are a lot of other groups who are coming in just straight from the marketing side, and the marketing is so obvious. It's like, whatever. It doesn't have any of the depth. And people who are just coming into the area, let's say that the kind of theme of UFOs, or the theme of some of these kind of supernatural experiences are becoming something that people are more curious about, then they're opening the door and finding these marketing ops flying at them. There has to be a way to separate out the junk conspiracy from real good research that stands up or at least presents a good argument.
Well, I think you'll find that best in the people that get into the cases and go case by case. But unfortunately, what you're talking about, when this phenomena comes to you, there's an aspect of it coming to you, the individual. Yeah, it has nothing to do with the commerce side. I know. Yeah, I go on TV. I sell books. I've been selling books because I like to do this as my primary job, investigate and research this stuff. So selling books is a way to pay the bills and buy the groceries so that I don't have to do another job. Because I'm certainly not a millionaire yet. Yes, I do have some things being developed, for TV that are moving along well that I don't talk about yet. You guys will know when certain things happen. But I keep separate. There's the commerce side of things, that commercial side, and then there's the side of what it's really about. And it does, that aspect of it coming to you. I think, unfortunately, the only real way people are going to see the difference is when they look, closer at the thing and when the thing comes to them. Because when it comes to you, it changes your perception of the world around you, your life, and why you do things and what you think about all this stuff. And one of the things it does, in changing you, you kind of get this discernment where you can look at things and say, well, that looks like, I used to think like everybody else it was this, but actually, now since, I've had this experience, this exposure, okay, now it indeed looks like that, whatever that is. And I think, unfortunately, and I don't think it's entirely an unfortunate thing, because for me, these experiences have been positive. I just think that that's what it's going to take for a lot of people, is actually experiencing it. And I do think everybody can. I don't believe in that, I am special, they come to me and let me tell you how they are and how it is. That's dangerous. And that's what some bozos out there are doing, as we know. But you have to be open to it. It can be a little scary. And again, I think that puts people off. So that commercial side of things goes back to making it more palatable. That's why it gets a lot of attention, because people say, people go about the UFO thing, their interest in UFOs and the whole the ET people, they go about it like selecting a favorite sports team, right?
Totally.
We're team ET, just like, if you're a Yankees fan or an Orioles fan or a whatever, New Orleans Saints fan, we're team ET. And particularly Americans do that. They go about it in that team thinking. And the problem with that is that the phenomena, they like to, the specific phenomenon we're talking about especially, it likes to manifest and express itself in terms to the individual. Okay? It is not. It's something anybody and everybody can experience, but the experience is not a collective experience. It is very much an individual experience in its most strongest manifestations, in its most clear manifestations. And as sinister and scary as this can sound to some people, it prefers to get you alone. Okay, because it has everything to do with your faith. Now, I'm not talking about just religious faith, although that's one of the threads in it. But that's what it does, is it comes to you and it wants you, I think, to not give a damn whether anybody believes you or not. It wants you to not care about whether you convince anyone of anything. And that's a Rubicon for that was a Rubicon that I crossed my Rubicon with this stuff. And I truly, I like talking about it, but honestly, deep down inside, push comes to shove, I don't really, I swear to God, Scout's honor, I don't care ultimately if people don't believe me in my experiences. I really don't care. And that's what it's looking for. It's, it makes itself evasive of scientific measurement, of, technological recording. It wants to remain very much something that manifests to you as an individual, so that okay? And I've said this before, people can tell you, oh, they look like this is where blah, blah, blah. This is what it was like, but all you're doing is hearing words about someone else's experience. You're not having that experience yourself. You're missing that layer of what it does to the subconscious. You're missing that layer of what it does, how it communicates and reaches in and touches the psyche, the inner soul. And that is everything in the experience. You can't, this is why the demand for disclosure, or when I hear these people get all pissed off and say, if you know something about this, you have to, you're obligated to share it with the public. Well, baloney, clearly that person has never experienced any of this stuff, because that's not the nature of it.
Fascinating. Yeah. I think that's a really good point. And also to kind of understand that it's not, as a phenomena, it's not something that has this widespread, every sighting fits the same notion. You can't fit them in that way. It's a completely mysterious phenomena. I think that's the important part. Miss Olivia, we only have 2 questions left. So you have to be incredibly selective. I know that
there are so many questions about the Men in Black.
I'll tell you, we're definitely going to do more, because we have to follow up on Jessup, and we're definitely going to have Walter back. So I promise you those questions.
Okay, this is a really juicy question I have to ask us. Jim Roy the Heretic, welcome back.
Hey, Jim Roy.
So do 3-letter agency Men in Black ever get Men in Blacked by other Men in Black?
That's great. Walter.
I think so. And in a way, there's an episode of that. Wow. I have an example of why I think they do. And I tried talking about it recently on a stream. And it bothered me to talk about it. And it's bothering me again. It had to do with my uncle, who, spent 44 years in the intel community before he was forced to retire because of his health. And some men who match the description of what we're talking about, either East Indians or such, maybe gypsies or whatever. It was, I won't go into it too much, because it really, for some weird reason, it bothers me to talk about. When I was an agent, I went to visit him, this particular time. And, I'm a federal agent. I'm involved with, stuff to the depth I'm involved with. I'm armed. Okay. Trained to, I've done protective service stuff. I'm trained and able to protect people from whatever assault, attack, or whatever. And he told me, in no uncertain terms, while I was there on this one time, that if I were to see, because where I stayed was upstairs, I'd be in the house. He said, look, if these particular men show up and you see them, if it goes bad and you see them attacking me, he told me, he said,
Oh, Walter, you still there?
Yeah, I'm still here. It just bothers me. Anyway, he said, just stay in the house. There's nothing I could do. That I couldn't get out there fast enough, and there'd be nothing I could do if they did something to him. So, and he was a guy who, a lot of this weird stuff, and you'll see in the book, you read the book, you'll see that I learned a lot of weird stuff about this stuff from him and who I think he was involved with. And the impression I got is that whoever these guys were, they might have been some of these guys we're talking about.
Right.
For, whatever reason, if you cross them or something. But that's that.
Wow. Yeah, that's a heavy one. When was that, Walter?
He told me that in, this would have been, I think, in 97 or 98. And, anyway.
It's a tough story. I'm only compelled to ask what happened to him because everyone's going to want to know.
Nothing like that happened, but when you're somebody, when you go into that line of work, you kind of see yourself as a protector of loved ones and stuff like that. To be told there's nothing you can do, that's a hard.
Wow. And well, it's interesting to me because when we hear about a lot of those Men in Black stories, the silence group, X-Protect, we hear about them having strange abilities like being able to cause heart attacks with a look and things of this nature. So I think that's maybe what he was getting at.
Yeah, whatever the case, yeah. Whatever the case was, it was the idea that you can do nothing, so don't go outside, stay in the house, and it's like, but I'm a badge-carrying federal agent. I have the legal authority to use lethal force, and so and the kind of person you are when you go into that line of work is you're ready to rock and roll to protect the innocent or the people that are being attacked. Now, don't get me wrong, my uncle, I wouldn't have taken him on when he was 80. Okay. It's a lot like my dad. I was never one of those guys that I'm gonna kick the old man's ass. No way. I would have got my ass kicked. Whatever age. And that's the way my uncle was. So he was really the toughest man I ever knew, the bravest man I ever knew. And he did crap I would never do. Like jumping out of airplanes was the least of it. Hell no, not unless I have to. This is also the same guy that taught me how to do necromancy. And stuff. So it was just, I don't know why, it's funny, at the time I didn't have the reaction. And for some reason now, when I try to tell that story, it just, I don't know if the impact of it, just seems to bother me more. But what I do is I let that kind of reaction, I let those things be my guide. And I think what that's doing is telling me that there was some deeper level there, that my intuitive response is telling me, oh yeah, there's something deeper there, and you're picking it up. But
yes,
so I do think the government type guys who do these sneaky deaky murky shadow men kind of jobs, and when you read the book, you'll see that I thought that about my uncle and who he was involved with and who he was vetting me for, recruiting me for. And I think these guys might have been the scenario, like you said, the Men in Black having some issue with the government Men in Black. I don't know.
Wow, absolutely fascinating. Incredible. And it's good that there's follow-up in the book if people want more about that, because it sounds like a very powerful experience. Before we leave tonight, I want to put on the record all 4 of those gifts of the Tuatha. We've got the Stone of Fall, the Spear of Lu, the Sword of Nuada, and the Cauldron of Dagda.
Sometimes they say the cauldron, sometimes they say the ampule of, or it gets, I see it as the cauldron.
Right.
And, so yeah, interesting stuff.
They are indeed. Miss Olivia, you get the last question of
Okay,
tonight.
so Bruce Wayne wanted to know, what's your take on Edward Snowden saying he couldn't find no proof of ET in CIA, NSA, or FBI files?
Look, I'm not buying that what Edward Snowden himself said about Edward Snowden's access. Okay, give me a friggin' break. Okay, Edward Snowden did not quite have the access. He's believing his own PR.
Uh-huh.
So I just don't think he had the clearance level to get at those things, and that's why he didn't find it. All right, this sounds to me like Mr. Snowden is trying to be relevant because his 15 minutes. Here's what happens when you end up like him and you end up over there. He's over there in Moscow. He's in Russia. He can't come home. Now he had his period of about 5 to 10 years where he was, boy, if he speaks, people listen. He had a movie made about him. But now I think he's getting to that point where now the hard part starts. He was kind of Snowden was old news. Now there's stuff that's new news, and he's looking at, oh shoot, this is real. I'm actually stuck here for the rest of my life. And I personally, I'm that cynical about why he said that and what this is about. I think he just wants to maintain his relevance. Or maybe, if Assange is going to be, pushed off the scene, maybe he wants to fill that spotlight on the stage, But I think it's just a cynical, self-serving move on his part. I don't think he had anywhere near the clearance to see what it is he said he was looking for. And I think that's a big nothing.
Wow, absolutely. Great questions, Miss Olivia. Fantastic. Nicely done. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 70. This was all Expertech, Morris Jessup, and then we got in deep with Walter on his new book, which is fascinating. Again, the book really kind of takes a personal view of the reasons and the ways that Walter arrived at his conclusions. Confessions of a Spooky Mind. This is coming out this weekend on Lulu. You can see it. Walter, I want to get your live, real-time reaction to something that Clarence Bloomfield Moore found. And here it is. Now, he found that in a strange Florida site, and it doesn't jibe with the other ruins around it. And basically, it was an anomaly in copper.
Wow. Okay. That, what were the circumstances it was found? Was it buried? Was it...
It was in a mound, actually, and the things that it was surrounded by would be typical kind of like arrowhead type stuff, but they dated some of what was around here. They couldn't actually date this, but they did date it back much older than things that are usually found in Florida. This is 3000 BC. So whatever it was, whoever made it.
Well, there's that classic, you've got that classic eye with the isosceles triangle, beam or whatever that is. I mean, that I found that symbolism in the Empire of the Wheel investigation. In fact, that's part of what kicked it off, was that shape showing up in a RV session I did, and that was the period and all that stuff that led to what I found about Hecate and all of that. So there's that symbol, 4 times on that thing. So, and what does the, was that an actual spiral, or was it more like a target thing with circles within circles? With a spiral?
Definitely a spiral. Yeah, no question. So pretty interesting.
Or,
give me that one again.
Oh, was that supposed to represent the top view of like a conical mound, a location, or does the spiral, is that saying something about energy or vortex, kind of thing, or portals or interdimensional space time? It's really that is an interesting thing, and if it is, you said what, 3,000 years old they estimated?
Yeah.
It's one of those things, right? Like, what do you say about that? If it's, hopefully it doesn't turn out that later someone, figures out that it was, just maybe a couple of hundred years ago and shoved underneath in that mound. But the mounds that's another one of those whole other conversation kind of topics.
No question, no question. Well, of course, Bloomfield Moore, being the son of Clara Jessup Bloomfield Moore, and her being the kind of bankroll for people like Keeley, it's kind of an interesting find in that regard, for sure. So everyone, thank you so much. Tonight was great to have Walter with us, and the book, Confessions of a Spooky Mind, as I said, available this weekend. Walter, terrific to have you here. Miss Olivia, thank you so much. And Walter, this one's coming out now this weekend. How do you feel about having finally done?
Well, it was kind of honestly even though I did a couple of false starts over the last couple of years, when I actually dug in, it was a fairly quick writing experience, because I'd been thinking on these things and I had started writing about them in the past. But it always feels good to get a book done. Seriously, it just always does. And this one, I've got a little anxiety because I'm not quite sure how it will be received, because it's not like my 10 other nonfiction books. Yeah, it's a lot about me and my experience, and it's not about other historical figure. There's not a lot of footnotes. I think there's only 20 in the whole book, and I think half of those are my smart-ass comments. So this is easy on the brain and light into me.
And what was that last line?
I said I think it'll give people more insight into where I'm coming from and what I really think about certain things.
Wow. Miss Olivia, yes.
Some people are asking whether it's going to be on audiobook.
I need to get into the audiobook thing. I have one book, Secret Missions 1, the one about Juan Cabrillo, that is recorded, that I do need to get out there. I'm overdue on that. And maybe now that I got this book done, I can catch up on getting that book out. But this would be a good one, actually, for audio. It'd be a very good one, and be pretty quick for me to produce. So I don't know, maybe soon.
Fantastic. Wow. Just incredible. So this one actually, I think, goes into very interesting places, and I can't wait to read the rest of it. I've seen those 2 chapters, which were very, very riveting. And I like that you're opening up and really getting into your own personal experiences with this too. I think in a sense, you're leading the way, because there comes a point with some of this research where people become very curious. How did you discover these things? And it's always good to add that personal story. It really gives it a dimension. It's great to have everyone here. We're going to come back on Thursday, and we've got the spookiest Halloween show, I can tell you, going deep into CERN with Gigi Young. Speaking of psychic, and we're going to be doing that on Thursday. It's a special show on Halloween, so please join us for that, everyone. And Olivia, the last word goes for you.
Well, I have to thank some people.
Yes.
So Kari Nonstad, Scabtree Scabby, Gaia Sophia, Maggie Smith, Big Papa Pump, Neil Hart, and Eric Ackerley. Thank you so much.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. Your support for the show is great. And I want to recommend that people go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for the newsletter, and also support the show, become a subscriber, or get behind it. We've made it very affordable for you guys. We have some great shows coming up for you, and we're going to be following the work of people like Walter very closely. And there might be some surprises with Walter too. There might be some interesting events coming up as well. So please keep posted on that. And Walter, we'll see you soon.
Thanks again, guys. Looking
Thanks,
forward to
Walter.
doing this again.
Pet tiki for me.
That's right. And we talk soon. Thanks so much. And everyone, do a couple of shout outs, I guess. Groovy, thanks so much. Appreciate. Was Dimensions out there tonight?
Yes, she was.
Carly, always doing a fantastic job on the forums. And we made it through any technical glitches to get really the interview we wanted out of Walter. Of course, we opened up a can of worms with Morris Jessup and Edgar Cayce in the first hour, and the whole X-Protect aspect. We're going to have to follow up on that in a follow-up to this episode right after the Halloween episode with Gigi. So this is quite heavy duty. What did you think of that? Amazing when he got into Tuatha. I mean, Tuatha
Yes.
and
Well,
much, you know.
Yeah, we have to talk to Gigi about that some more, I think.
No question at all. And it is fascinating that a lot of this work is starting to tie in together, because when we think about all the things that we've brought forward about the hot zone and Egerton Sykes, and then we start to go into the Celtic aspect and some of the supernatural aspects of the Tuatha, then it starts to really come together. We get the full picture. And I do think it's important as a kind of a closing thought to think about people like Jessup, who were bringing so much to the culture as part of this X-Share type activity on the UFO file, on the ancient mysteries, the consciousness of ancient Atlantis and things of that nature. For them to be kind of ruthlessly wiped out is a very telling thing. And we must resist agencies who would block the truth from the citizenry, which demands the truth. And, I think we see a lot of this when we see the CIA, for example, move into the UFO field. It's not a healthy development by any stretch of the imagination. And it will be the kind of thing that I'll point out over and over again on this show. There's not going to be any cooperation with the CIA and the UFO file, which is they're really pushing that heavily now. And I think that there's a long history of why this is resisted. And that's not to say everyone who works in intelligence is a bad guy. That would be ridiculous. But the fundamental point of hidden clandestine power operating in an unaccountable fashion is not acceptable. And we've seen it abused over and over again. And when it comes to the UFO file, you definitely can't let it happen. And Jessup was really a snapshot of a case. And really, when we think about the things that he brought forward, this is somebody who really moved the culture forward. And this is how he closed it out. Saucer Man suicide. Police said tonight that Morris K. Jessup, 59, widely known writer on flying saucers, took his own life with a hose linked to his automobile's exhaust pipe. Jessup, a mathematician and astronomer, was a former University of Michigan and Drake University professor. That was the headline.
Oh, no respect.
Fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
But we here, looking back some 60 years later, can see the truth into aspects of what actually happened. And it had to do very deeply with this X-Protect, X-Share battle that was going on. And the X-Share people trying to move the culture forward, it's crucial that we find those people and support them and point out when we look at it, like James Forrestal is another great example. When those things have happened, they've been real benchmarks for everything that's taken place since, and you can go all the way back to the Kennedy assassination and beyond for that. So, we need a transparent society, and when it comes to these matters, an incredible level of transparency is required, and you can't sign over your future or something as important as work around the UFO file to some clandestine agency working for God knows who, but it's certainly X-Protect at the heart of it. So thank you very much for joining us. It was a really great thing to have Walter
Can
here.
I throw in a question? I wanted to ask, this is one of the questions I really wanted to ask.
Yeah.
I'll ask you. Okay, so Andrew J. wanted to know, in aerospace today, there are plenty of secretive programs going on. You're telling me employees with proper clearance are being MK Ultra'd to keep the program secret? What say you?
Oh, there's no question. Those are levels of compartmentalization. So it wouldn't surprise me at all. I mean, as we know, Walter worked in AFOSI. That's the Special Operations Intelligence Group inside the Air Force. If he's talking about it, then it's pretty easy to imagine that that's taking place. But I also feel that they're so good at compartmentalization that they don't always need to do that. But certainly, look at the hot zone. If you see something, if you see ruins and you report it, you could potentially go to jail because you've signed something that says you can't report on it. That's the end of the discussion, really, isn't it? Well, because of people like Paulina Zalitsky and others that we brought forward on this program, we know that there's something else happening there. So therefore, lifting the veil and that kind of secrecy isn't easy, but it's a crucial thing absolutely to do. Great questions tonight. The ideas room was hopping, just fantastic. It's great to see everyone out there. And I see Patrick, Lee, Tessa. I know Tessa Dick was out there asking great questions as well. We will see you all. Gaia Sophia, great to see you. Grandma Tippy Toes, fantastic. And we will see everyone next Thursday with Gigi Young for Halloween. And that is going to be, Olivia, I know you're spooky on Halloween. It's just going to amp it up even more.
It'll be fun. I can't wait.
And your weekend, Miss Olivia? What's your weekend thought here?
Oh, I have to have a weekend. I'm just counting the days to Halloween. That's it.
Well, you're a chocolate buff. We know
Kit Kats. It's my excuse for chocolate.
Najat, it's great to see you out there too. And Dr. Farrell, of course, it's fantastic to see you. Joseph, we'll be talking soon. Carl Young, really great crowd tonight. Really
fantastic.
Off the charts. Terrific. And we will see you all next Thursday.
Okay. Good night, everybody.
Have a great night. And of course, I'm going to end the broadcast, but it never really ends. Even the software agrees.